The gunshot echoed through the Colorado Canyon like thunder, sending ravens spiraling into the steel-gray October sky. 24-year-old Elizabeth Harper pressed herself against the cold rock wall of the stagecoach station, her heart hammering, as she watched a man stumble from the tree line, blood spreading across his white shirt like spilled wine. Behind him, 3 riders emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and bandanas, rifles glinting in the dying light. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Please, the wounded man gasped, reaching toward the station. Tell my brother, tell Daniel that Elizabeth... His words dissolved into a wet cough as he collapsed face first into the dirt, his body going still as stone. Elizabeth's traveling dress rustled as she shrank deeper into the shadows, one hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a scream. She had traveled over 1,000 miles from Boston to marry this man, Thomas Caldwell, a rancher she knew only through 6 months of carefully written letters. Now he lay dead in the dust, while his killers sat their horses not 50 yards away, scanning the area for witnesses. But this moment of horror was still 3 days in Elizabeth's future. 3 days earlier, she had been standing on the platform at Boston's South Station, clutching a worn leather valise and a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon, her stomach churning with equal parts excitement and terror. The whistle shriek of the departing train still rang in Elizabeth's ears as she watched the familiar skyline of Boston disappear into morning mist. She had risen before dawn to catch the westbound express, leaving behind the cramped boarding house room that had been her home for the past 2 years since her parents' death. Everything she owned in the world was packed into the single valise. At her feet and the small trunk in the baggage car, Elizabeth adjusted her dark green traveling dress, her finest garment, purchased specifically for meeting her intended husband, and smoothed the matching jacket that had cost her 3 weeks' wages from her position as a seamstress in Mrs. Whitmore's dress shop. The other passengers in the ladies' car looked prosperous and comfortable, their clothing speaking of established families and secure futures. Elizabeth felt like an imposter among them, a woman with no family, no inheritance, and no prospects beyond the uncertain promise of a man she had never met. She pulled Thomas Caldwell's latest letter from her reticule, though she had memorized every word. His handwriting was bold and confident, the paper quality good, suggesting a man of some means and education. "My dearest Elizabeth," it began, "I count the days until October 15th when you will arrive in Silverton. I have spent these months preparing our home for your arrival, adding a proper kitchen garden, and expanding the cabin to include a parlor where you can pursue your sewing. I believe we shall be very happy together in this beautiful valley." The letter went on to describe the ranch he had built in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado Territory, painting pictures of pristine meadows and clear streams, of cattle growing fat on mountain grass, of a life of honest work and simple pleasures far from the smoke and noise of industrial Boston. Most importantly, he wrote of his desire for a true partnership in marriage, not merely a housekeeper or ornament, but a woman with her own mind and opinions who would help him build something lasting. Elizabeth had answered an advertisement in the Boston Herald 3 months earlier, one of dozens placed by Western men seeking wives. Most had been crude or desperate, offering little beyond protection in exchange for domestic labor. But Thomas Caldwell's carefully worded notice had stood out. Established ranchers in Colorado Territory seeks intelligent women of good character for marriage. Must be willing to embrace frontier life. Preference given to those with practical skills, no drinkers or fortune seekers. Serious inquiries only. Their correspondence had been formal at first, each party trying to assess the other's character and suitability. Elizabeth had been honest about her circumstances, orphaned at 22 when her parents died in a factory fire, forced to work as a seamstress to survive, possessing little beyond her education and skills with needle and thread. Thomas had been equally forthright about his situation. A bachelor of 31 who had spent 8 years building a ranch in a remote mountain country, successful but isolated, seeking a wife to share the life he had created. As their letters continued, they had grown warmer and more personal. Thomas wrote about his love of the mountains, his small herd of prize cattle, his hopes for the future. Elizabeth shared her dreams of having a real home, a garden, perhaps children someday. She told him about her childhood in Vermont before her family moved to Boston, how she missed the countryside and open spaces. Most significantly, Thomas had sent money for her journey without her asking, along with detailed instructions for reaching Silverton and assurances that if she found him unsuitable, he would pay for her return to Boston. This gesture of trust and consideration had convinced Elizabeth that he was indeed an honorable man, worth the enormous risk she was taking. Now, as the train carried her westward through an increasingly unfamiliar landscape, Elizabeth tried to calm her nerves by reviewing the practical preparations she had made. She had sold everything of value except her mother's silver thimble and her father's Bible, using the money to purchase fabric and notions for establishing a seamstress business if needed. Her trunk contained yards of quality material, threads, needles and patterns, insurance against destitution if the marriage proved unsuitable. She had also spent her final weeks in Boston, learning what she could about frontier life. Mrs. O'Malley, the Irish cook at her boarding house, had taught her to make bread without eggs and preserve meat without ice. Mr. Jameson at the general store had advised her on practical clothing and explained the basics of managing money when stores were far apart. Even old Dr. Brennan had given her a bottle of laudanum and basic medical supplies, warning her that doctors were scarce in mining country. But all the preparation in the world couldn't quiet the fundamental question that haunted her as mile after mile of strange country rolled past the window. What if she had made a terrible mistake? Elizabeth had seen other women make desperate choices in Boston. Sarah Mills had married the first man who offered, a widower with 6 children who treated her like an unpaid servant. Mary Costello had accepted a position as a mill girl in Lowell, where the work was killing her slowly. Elizabeth herself had faced the prospect of eventual poverty as her looks faded and her fingers grew too stiff for fine sewing. Marriage to Thomas Caldwell represented her one chance at a different life, but it required betting everything on a man she knew only through words on paper. He could be cruel, dishonest, or simply incompatible with her temperament. The Colorado Territory could be harsher than she imagined, the isolation more crushing than liberating. She might find herself trapped in a life worse than the one she was leaving, with no way home and no resources to escape. Yet, as the train crossed into Pennsylvania and the landscape began to open up, Elizabeth felt a surprising sense of liberation. For the first time in her adult life, she was making her own choice about her future, not accepting whatever opportunity presented itself, not merely surviving from week to week, but actively pursuing a vision of the life she wanted to live. Thomas's letters had revealed a man who read books, who thought deeply about the world, who wanted a wife he could talk to about more than household tasks. He wrote about the beauty of sunrise over the peaks, about the satisfaction of watching his cattle thrive, about his dreams of building something permanent in a country that was still being born. These were not the words of a man who would mistreat a woman or view her as property. The journey west took 4 days, with changes in Chicago and Denver. At each stop, Elizabeth observed the other passengers and noted how the crowd grew rougher and more diverse as they moved away from the civilized East. Cowboys returning from cattle drives, miners seeking new strikes, immigrants heading for farmland. women traveling to join husbands or brothers already established in the West. The conversations she overheard spoke of opportunities and dangers unknown in Boston, of fortunes made and lost overnight, of conflicts with Indian tribes, of vigilante justice and sudden violence. In Chicago, she shared a meal with Mrs. Catherine Morgan, a widow traveling to Oregon to keep a house for her son's family. Mrs. Morgan had made a similar journey 20 years earlier as a young bride and offered practical advice about frontier life. "The first thing you must understand," Mrs. Morgan said over coffee in the station restaurant, "is that Western men judge women differently than Eastern society does. They don't care if you can play piano or speak French. What matters is whether you can work beside them, whether you can be trusted in a crisis, and whether you have the strength to endure hardship without complaining." She paused to sip her coffee, studying Elizabeth's face. "You have good bones and strong hands. That will serve you better than beauty out there. But the real question is whether you can adapt your thinking as well as your circumstances. The West changes people, usually for the better if they let it." Elizabeth absorbed this wisdom, noting how Mrs. Morgan carried herself with a quiet confidence that spoke of hard-won experience. This was what she wanted to become, not merely a survivor, but a woman shaped by challenge into something stronger than she had been. In Denver, Elizabeth caught her first glimpse of the Rocky Mountains, their snow-capped peaks rising like a wall against the western sky. The sight took her breath away, making her understand for the first time the scale of the country she was entering. These mountains dwarfed anything she had seen in Vermont, suggesting a landscape that could swallow human ambitions without trace. The final leg of her journey, from Denver to Silverton, required a narrow-gauge railroad that climbed into the heart of the San Juan Range. The train wound through an increasingly spectacular but hostile-looking country, deep canyons, vertical rock faces, and forests that seemed to stretch forever. Elizabeth found herself both awed by the beauty and intimidated by the obvious dangers of this wilderness. Her fellow passengers on this last stretch included miners, merchants, and a few other women traveling to join men in the mining camps. The conversation was dominated by talk of recent Indian troubles, harsh winters, and the lawlessness that plagued isolated communities. Elizabeth began to understand that Silverton was not just remote, but genuinely dangerous, a place where federal authority was weak and survival depended on individual strength and community cooperation. As the train approached its destination, Elizabeth's nervousness intensified. In less than an hour, she would meet the man who might become her husband, see the home that might become hers, and begin a life that would either fulfill her dreams or destroy them. She had no way of knowing which outcome awaited her, but she faced that uncertainty with growing determination. Whatever Thomas Caldwell proved to be, whatever challenges the Colorado Territory presented, Elizabeth Harper was ready to meet them, on her own terms. She had left Boston as a woman with few options. She would enter Silverton as a woman prepared to fight for her future. The train whistle announced their arrival as the mountain town came into view, a collection of wooden buildings, scattered along a river valley, surrounded by peaks that seemed to scrape the sky. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and Elizabeth could see men working around mining equipment and livestock in corrals. It looked crude and temporary compared to Boston, but it also looked alive with possibility. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to step into her new life, Elizabeth thought of the letter in her reticule and Thomas Caldwell's promise that they would be happy together. Whether that promise would be kept remained to be seen, but she was ready to find out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conductor called Silverton, and Elizabeth Harper stepped from the train into the thin mountain air. her future stretching ahead of her like the vast Colorado sky. The wooden platform of Silverton's train station was rougher and smaller than Elizabeth had expected, little more than a raised boardwalk beside the tracks. As she stepped down with her valise, the thin mountain air hit her lungs like a physical blow, making her dizzy. At 8,000 feet above sea level, every breath required conscious effort, and she found herself gasping slightly as she looked around for Thomas Caldwell. The October afternoon was crisp and bright, with a bite in the air that promised winter's early arrival. Elizabeth pulled her shawl tighter and studied the small crowd gathered around the train. Miners in dirty clothes, merchants in worn suits, and a few women in practical dresses moved about their business with the hurried efficiency of people, accustomed to harsh weather and short seasons. But no one approached her with the warm smile of recognition she had expected. No tall, brown-haired rancher stepped forward to claim his mail-order bride. Elizabeth stood alone on the platform as the train prepared to continue its journey north, her confidence beginning to crack. She approached the station agent, a grizzled man with a grey beard who was checking papers at a small wooden desk. "Excuse me, sir, I'm looking for Thomas Caldwell. He was supposed to meet the afternoon train." The agent looked up with sharp eyes that seemed to assess her instantly. "Tom Caldwell? Haven't seen him today, miss? Though that's not unusual. Tom's ranch is a fair piece out of town, and he doesn't come in regular-like." Elizabeth felt the first stir of unease. Thomas's letter had been specific about meeting the October 15th train. How far is his ranch? Could something have delayed him? "Oh, 12, maybe 15 miles up Mineral Creek. Could be any number of things that kept him away. Stock trouble, weather, equipment breakdown. Ranch work doesn't stop for train schedules." The agent returned to his papers, dismissing her concerns with the casual indifference of someone who had seen many disappointed travelers. Elizabeth walked to the edge of the platform and looked out over the town. Silverton was larger than she had imagined from the train window, with perhaps 2,000 residents scattered along the valley floor. The main street bustled with activity. Freight wagons, hauling supplies to the mines, riders coming and going, and the constant sound of hammering and construction that marked a growing town. But the settlement had a temporary, almost desperate quality that unsettled her. Most buildings were simple wooden structures that looked like they could be abandoned at a moment's notice. The mountains loomed over everything like prison walls, beautiful but oppressive, making the town feel trapped and isolated from the civilized world. As the afternoon lengthened and Thomas failed to appear, Elizabeth's unease deepened into real worry. She had nowhere to go and limited funds for unexpected delays. Her travel money was carefully calculated to get her to Silverton with only a small reserve for emergencies. An extended stay in a hotel, if the town even had one, would quickly exhaust her resources. She approached a woman loading supplies into a wagon outside the general store. The woman was perhaps 40, dressed in practical wool and leather, with the weathered hands and direct manner of someone accustomed to frontier life. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm Elizabeth Harper, and I'm looking for Thomas Caldwell. Do you know him?" The woman straightened and studied Elizabeth with curiosity. "Of course I know Tom. I'm Ruth Patterson. My husband Ben and I run cattle with Tom sometimes. You must be the bride he's been expecting." Relief flooded through Elizabeth. Finally, someone who knew Thomas and could help her understand the situation. "Yes, I am. He was supposed to meet my train, but he didn't show up. I'm beginning to worry something might be wrong." Ruth's expression grew troubled. "That's not like Tom. He's reliable as sunrise, and he's been talking about your arrival for weeks. Let me finish loading these supplies and I'll ride out to check on him. You can wait at the hotel." "How long would that take?" Elizabeth asked. Though she was grateful for any help. "Hotel's not much, but it's clean. Mrs. Hendricks runs it properly. As for checking on Tom, it'd be a hard ride there and back before dark. Might have to wait until morning." Ruth studied Elizabeth's face. "You look scared, honey. This is a rough country, but Tom Caldwell's a good man. If he's not here, there's a reason." Ruth's kindness was reassuring, but Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Thomas's letters had portrayed him as meticulous and considerate. He wouldn't leave her stranded without a word unless something had prevented him from coming. The Silverton Hotel was a 2-story wooden building that advertised clean rooms and good meals in faded paint across its front. Mrs. Hendricks, a stout woman with greying hair and kind eyes, welcomed Elizabeth warmly once she explained her situation. "Mr. Caldwell, yes, he's mentioned you several times when he's been in town. A thoughtful man, always asking about what supplies a lady might need at his place. Don't you worry, dear. Something's just delayed him." The room Mrs. Hendricks provided was small but scrupulously clean, with a narrow bed, washstand and single window overlooking the main street. Elizabeth unpacked her few belongings and tried to calm her growing anxiety by reviewing Thomas's letters, looking for any clue about what might have gone wrong. His most recent letter, dated just 2 weeks earlier, had been filled with excitement about her impending arrival. He had described improvements to the cabin, the excellent condition of his cattle, and his plans for showing her the most beautiful spots on his property. Nothing suggested any problems or concerns that might prevent him from meeting her train. As evening fell over Silverton, Elizabeth stood at her window watching the town settle into night. Oil lamps flickered in windows, and the sounds of the day gave way to music and laughter from the saloons. But the mountains remained dark and silent, offering no clues about Thomas Caldwell's whereabouts. She tried to eat the dinner Mrs. Hendricks brought to her room, but worry had killed her appetite. Every scenario she imagined seemed worse than the last. Thomas could be injured, trapped by an early snowstorm, or dealing with some crisis on his ranch. Worse possibilities lurked at the edges of her mind. What if he had changed his mind about marrying her? What if the considerate man of the letters was a fiction, and she had traveled 1,000 miles to meet a stranger who no longer wanted? Her sleep came fitfully, broken by unfamiliar sounds and the anxiety that clawed at her chest. Elizabeth had never felt so alone or vulnerable. In Boston, she had at least known the rules and dangers of city life. Here in this mountain wilderness, she was completely dependent on the kindness of strangers and the promises of a man who might already have abandoned her. The next morning brought no better news. Ruth Patterson returned from town with a grim expression that immediately set Elizabeth's heart racing. "I rode out to Tom's place at first light," Ruth said without preamble. "Found his cattle scattered and the cabin empty. Looks like he left in a hurry, maybe 3 days ago. His horse is gone, but his pack mule's still in the corral." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you think happened?" Ruth hesitated before answering. "Hard to say. Could be he went after straying cattle and got delayed. But—" She paused, clearly reluctant to voice her real concerns. "But what?" Elizabeth pressed. "There's been trouble in the area lately. Bushwhackers hitting isolated ranches, stealing stock, sometimes worse. Tom might have run into them, or he might have gone to help a neighbor who did." The word bushwhackers sent a chill through Elizabeth. In her correspondence with Thomas, he had mentioned the beauty and isolation of his ranch, but had never suggested it might be dangerous. Now she was learning that the peaceful mountain valley he had described was actually a place where armed men preyed on isolated settlers. "What should I do?" Elizabeth asked, though she dreaded the answer. Ruth's expression was sympathetic but honest. "Wait and see if he turns up. Could be he's tracking stolen cattle and will be back any day. Could be he's helping with some emergency and lost track of time. Tom's survived 8 years up here, so he knows how to take care of himself." And if he doesn't come back? The question hung in the air between them, neither woman wanting to voice the possibilities. If Thomas was dead or permanently missing, Elizabeth would be stranded in Silverton with no money, no prospects, and winter approaching. Fast. The mountain passes would soon be impassable, trapping her until spring, in a town where she knew no one and had no means of support. "Let's not get into trouble," Ruth said finally. "Give it a few more days. Meanwhile, you can stay at the hotel, and Ben and I will keep asking around. Someone might have seen Tom or know where he went." Over the next 2 days, Elizabeth lived. In a state of suspended anxiety, she helped Mrs. Hendricks with hotel tasks to earn her keep, but her mind remained focused on Thomas Caldwell's mysterious absence. Various townspeople offered theories. He was tracking rustlers, helping with a difficult carving, or simply delayed by bad weather in the high country. But none of them sounded entirely convinced by their own explanations. On the 3rd day, everything changed. Elizabeth was hanging laundry behind the hotel when she heard the rapid approach of multiple horses. She looked up to see 3 riders coming down the main street at a gallop, their animals lathered with sweat and their faces grim with urgency. The lead rider dismounted outside the general store and began shouting for attention. "Doc Henderson! Someone get Doc Henderson! We got a wounded man!" Elizabeth dropped the laundry and ran toward the commotion, her heart pounding with a terrible certainty that this had something to do with Thomas. A crowd quickly gathered as the riders carefully lifted an unconscious man from one of the horses. Even from a distance, Elizabeth could see the blood-soaked clothing and pale, still face. But as she pushed through the crowd for a better look, she realized, with a mixture of relief and confusion, that the wounded man was not Thomas Caldwell. This man was younger, perhaps mid-20s, with dark hair and a beard. He was unconscious, but breathing, with what appeared to be a bullet wound in his shoulder. Dr. Henderson, a thin, nervous man in his 50s, took charge immediately. "Get him to my office. Carefully now, don't jostle that shoulder more than necessary." As they carried the wounded man away, Elizabeth approached one of the riders, a young cowboy still breathing hard from the desperate ride to town. "What happened?" she asked. "Was he shot?" The cowboy nodded grimly. "Bushwhackers hit Caldwell Place yesterday evening. We found this fella crawling toward the road, shot up bad. Kept saying something about his brother Tom and a woman named Elizabeth." Elizabeth's world tilted sideways. "His brother Tom? Thomas Caldwell?" "That's right. This here's Daniel Caldwell, Tom's younger brother. You know them?" Before Elizabeth could answer, her knees buckled, and she found herself sitting hard on the wooden sidewalk as the full implications crashed over her. Thomas had a brother he had never mentioned in his letters. That brother was now wounded, possibly dying, after some kind of attack on Thomas's ranch, and Thomas himself was nowhere to be found. The cowboy knelt beside her, his young face creased with concern. "You all right, miss? You look white as a sheet." "I'm Elizabeth Harper," she managed to say. "I came here to marry Thomas Caldwell. Is Thomas?" The cowboy's expression grew even more troubled. "Ma'am, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but we couldn't find Tom anywhere on the property. Place was shot up pretty bad, and there was blood but nobody. Could be he got away, could be they took him with them, could be—" He trailed off, unable to voice the worst possibility. Elizabeth closed her eyes and tried to process this nightmare. She had traveled across a continent to marry a man who was now missing, possibly dead. His brother, whom she had never heard of, lay wounded and unconscious, unable to tell her what had happened. She was stranded in a frontier town with winter approaching, no money, and no one to turn to for help. When she opened her eyes, Ruth Patterson was kneeling beside her, having appeared from somewhere in the crowd. "Elizabeth, honey, I heard what happened. This is terrible news, but don't give up hope yet. Tom's tough and smart. If anyone could survive bushwhackers, it's him." But Elizabeth could see the doubt in Ruth's eyes, even as she offered comfort. The reality was becoming clear. Thomas Caldwell was almost certainly dead, killed by the same men who had shot his brother. The life Elizabeth had traveled so far to claim had been destroyed before she could even glimpse it. As they helped her to her feet and guided her back toward the hotel. Elizabeth felt as if she were walking through a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Everything she had sacrificed, every hope she had nurtured, every plan she had made, all of it was crumbling around her like the first snows that were already dusting the highest peaks. The worst part was the uncertainty, not knowing whether Thomas was dead or captured, whether Daniel would survive his wounds, or what any of it meant for her own future. She was trapped in a story where all the main characters were missing or dying, leaving her alone to face whatever came next. As they reached the hotel, Elizabeth looked back toward the doctor's office, where Daniel Caldwell fought for his life. He was her only link to Thomas now, the only person who might be able to tell her what had really happened at the ranch. Whether he lived or died could determine not just the mystery of Thomas's fate, but Elizabeth's own chances of survival in this harsh and unforgiving land. Daniel Caldwell drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days, his fever spiking and breaking while Dr. Henderson fought to save his life. Elizabeth found herself keeping vigil at his bedside, partly from concern for the wounded man and partly because he represented her only hope of learning Thomas's fate. During Daniel's lucid moments, he would try to speak, but the words came out fragmented and unclear. "Tom rode out 3 riders," Elizabeth had to warn. Then the fever would claim him again, leaving Elizabeth with more questions than answers. Dr. Henderson, a man more accustomed to treating mining accidents than gunshot wounds, worked tirelessly to remove the bullet and prevent infection. "It's lodged near the shoulder blade," he explained to Elizabeth on the second day. "Missed the lung by inches, but he's lost a lot of blood. The next 48 hours will tell the tale." Elizabeth had never been in a sick room before, but she found herself naturally falling into the role of nurse. She helped change bandages, administered laudanum for pain, and kept cool clothes on Daniel's burning forehead. Mrs. Hendricks provided what medical supplies she could from the hotel's limited stock, while Ruth Patterson brought broth and fresh vegetables from her ranch. "You've got a gentle touch," Dr. Henderson observed, as Elizabeth carefully spooned water between Daniel's cracked lips. "Have you done nursing work before?" "No," Elizabeth replied, adjusting the pillow beneath Daniel's head. "But my mother was sickly before she died. I learned to care for her." What she didn't mention was how helpless she had felt during her mother's final illness, unable to afford proper medical care or even adequate food. Here, at least, she could do something useful, could feel that her presence made a difference in someone's recovery. On the 3rd evening, Daniel's fever finally broke. Elizabeth was dozing in the chair beside his bed when his voice, weak but clear, broke the silence. "Water." Elizabeth's eyes snapped open, and she reached for the pitcher on the bedside table. "Easy," she said, supporting his head as he drank. "Don't try to sit up too quickly." Daniel's eyes focused on her face with difficulty. "You're Elizabeth. Tom said you were coming." His voice was hoarse from fever and medication. "Yes, I'm Elizabeth Harper. I came to marry your brother." She paused, steeling herself for the question she had to ask. "Daniel, what happened to Thomas? Where is he?" Daniel closed his eyes, and for a moment Elizabeth feared he had lost consciousness again. But when he opened them, they were filled with pain that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. Bushwhackers came just after sundown, 3 of them, maybe 4. Tom had been expecting trouble, cattle missing, signs of riders watching the place. "He sent me to check the north pasture while he secured the cabin." Daniel paused, gathering strength to continue. "I heard shooting and rode back hard. Found Tom in the yard, fighting them off. They had him outnumbered, but he was giving as good as he got." His voice broke slightly. "I tried to help, but one of them got me from behind. Last I saw, Tom was still standing, but there was blood." "Did you see what happened to him?" Elizabeth pressed gently. "I was going in and out. Think they might have taken him alive. Or maybe he got away into the mountains. When I came to, the place was empty, except for dead horses and spent shells. I crawled toward the road, hoping someone would find me. The partial answers were almost worse than complete ignorance. Thomas might be alive but captive, or wounded and hiding in the wilderness, or already dead in some remote canyon. Without a body, Elizabeth could neither mourn properly nor abandon hope entirely. Dr. Henderson entered the room, pleased to find his patient awake and coherent. After examining Daniel's wound and pronouncing himself satisfied with the healing, he turned to practical matters. "You'll need several weeks to recover full use of that arm," he told Daniel, "and you shouldn't be riding hard or doing heavy work for at least a month." Daniel struggled to sit up, his face pale with effort and determination. "Doc, I need to get back out there. Tom might be hurt, might need help, and those bushwhackers are still loose." "You're in no condition to help anyone," Dr. Henderson said, firmly. "Right now you can barely lift your arm. Give it time." But Elizabeth could see the desperate frustration in Daniel's eyes. She understood that feeling of helplessness, of being forced to wait, while terrible uncertainties ate away at you. An idea began forming in her mind, born partly from compassion and partly from her own need to take action. "Daniel," she said quietly, "what if I helped you?" Both men stared at her in surprise. Dr. Henderson spoke first. "Miss Harper, this isn't women's work. The mountains in winter are no place for a lady from back east." Elizabeth felt a familiar flash of irritation at being dismissed because of her sex and origins. "What I meant was, what if I stayed at the ranch and helped Daniel while he recovers? He knows the land and the situation, but he needs someone to handle the daily tasks he can't manage with one arm." Daniel studied her face intently. "Elizabeth, you don't understand what you're offering. The ranch is isolated and those bushwhackers might come back. It's dangerous, and there's no guarantee Tom will ever—" "I understand perfectly," Elizabeth interrupted. "But what alternative do I have? I came here to build a life with Thomas. If he's dead, I have no resources to return east and nowhere to go here. If he's alive, someone needs to maintain his property until he returns. Either way, I might as well be useful." Ruth Patterson, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. "Elizabeth, honey, you don't know what frontier ranch work involves. It's not just cooking and cleaning. There's livestock to tend, repairs to make, supplies to manage. In winter, one mistake can kill you. Then teach me," Elizabeth said with growing determination. "I'm not afraid of hard work, and I learn quickly. Daniel can guide me, and I can provide the physical help he needs while he heals." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks against the benefits. "The ranch does need tending," he admitted reluctantly. "Cattle scattered, winter supplies to organize, repairs needed before the hard weather hits, and someone should be there in case Tom comes back." Dr. Henderson shook his head. "This is madness. Miss Harper, you're talking about spending winter in an isolated cabin with a man you barely know, in a country where violent men are known to operate. It's improper and dangerous." Elizabeth felt a surge of the same determination that had carried her away from Boston. "Dr. Propriety is a luxury I can't afford. I have $23 to my name and no family to return to. My choices are to find a way to survive here or slowly starve in town while waiting for a spring I might not live to see." Ruth looked between Elizabeth and Daniel, then nodded slowly. "If you're set on this course, I'll help you prepare. Ben and I can teach you basic ranch skills and we'll check on you regularly. But Elizabeth, you need to understand, if those bushwhackers come back, being a woman won't protect you. You'll need to be ready to fight." The word fight sent a chill through Elizabeth, but she pushed the fear aside. She had made her choice, and she would see it through whatever the consequences. Over the next week, Elizabeth received an intensive education in frontier survival. Ruth Patterson proved to be a demanding but effective teacher, showing Elizabeth how to milk cows, tend chickens, and preserve meat. Ben Patterson taught her to shoot, starting with an old pistol and progressing to a rifle once her hands stopped shaking. "Don't think of it as killing," Ben advised, as Elizabeth struggled with her first target practice. "Think of it as protecting what's yours. Out here, that's not just a right, it's a responsibility." Mrs. Hendricks contributed lessons in frontier cooking, how to make meals stretch when supplies were short, how to bake bread without proper ovens, and how to identify edible plants in case emergency rations ran low. Even Dr. Henderson, despite his disapproval of the plan, taught Elizabeth basic medical care for treating wounds and illnesses when professional help was days away. Daniel, meanwhile, was recovering faster than expected. His natural strength and youth worked in his favor, and by the end of the week he could move his arm without severe pain, though heavy lifting remained impossible. "You're sure about this?" he asked Elizabeth the night before they were scheduled to leave for the ranch. They were sitting in the hotel parlor, planning their departure while October snow fell softly outside. "I'm sure," Elizabeth replied, though her stomach churned with nervousness. "Are you concerned about my ability to help, or about the propriety of our arrangement?" Daniel smiled slightly, the first real smile she had seen from him. "Miss Harper, after watching you handle my fever and learn to shoot in 1 week, I'm not worried about your abilities. As for propriety," he shrugged. "Out here, survival matters more than what people think." Elizabeth appreciated his directness. Daniel was different from Thomas in temperament. Where Thomas's letters had been thoughtful and deliberate, Daniel seemed more impulsive and direct. But she sensed the same fundamental decency in him, the same respect for her as a person rather than merely a woman to be protected or controlled. "There's something else we need to discuss," Daniel said, his expression growing serious. "Those bushwhackers took most of our ready cash and some valuable items. We'll have enough supplies to get through winter if we're careful. But there won't be money for extras or emergencies." "I have a little money," Elizabeth offered. "Keep it for yourself. What I'm saying is, this won't be comfortable living. The cabin's solid but small, the work is hard, and there'll be long stretches where we see no other people. You'll be trading a hotel room and regular meals for uncertainty and isolation." Elizabeth considered this soberly. "Daniel, what I had in Boston wasn't really living. It was just surviving from day to day with no hope of anything better. At least here, I'm working towards something, even if I don't know what that something is yet." The next morning, Ben Patterson arrived with a wagon to transport Elizabeth's belongings and supplies for the ranch. Daniel, still moving carefully but determined to make the journey, climbed onto the wagon seat beside Ben, while Elizabeth settled in the back among sacks of flour, coffee, and other necessities. As they left Silverton behind and headed into the mountains, Elizabeth felt the same mixture of fear and excitement she had experienced leaving Boston. Once again, she was traveling toward an unknown future, but this time she was better prepared for the challenges ahead. The road to the Caldwell Ranch followed Mineral Creek up into a narrow valley surrounded by towering peaks already dusted with snow. The landscape was beautiful but harsh, with few signs of human habitation once they left the main trail. Elizabeth began to understand why Thomas had found it difficult to find a wife locally. This was a country that demanded enormous strength and adaptability from anyone who tried to make a life here. "There it is," Daniel said, as they created a ridge and looked down into a sheltered valley. "The Caldwell place." Elizabeth's first sight of what might become her home was sobering. The main cabin was larger than she had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney, but bullet holes in the walls and broken windows testified to the recent violence. Outbuildings included a barn, chicken coop, and several storage sheds, all showing signs of hasty searching by the bushwhackers. "It looks worse than it is," Daniel said, noting her expression. "Most of the damage is superficial. We can have it livable again in a few days." As they unloaded the wagon and began the work of restoration, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of homecoming. This wasn't the life she had planned, but it was a life she could build through her own efforts. Whatever happened with Thomas, whatever. Dangers lay ahead. She was no longer a passive victim of circumstances. She was becoming someone who could fight for what she wanted, someone strong enough to survive in this beautiful, dangerous place. The transformation that had begun with her decision to leave Boston was continuing, shaped by necessity, into something she was only beginning to understand. Looking around at the mountain valley that Thomas had chosen for his home, Elizabeth began to see it not as a temporary refuge, but as a place where she might truly belong. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, but she was ready to find out what kind of woman this wilderness would make her. The first week at the Caldwell Ranch tested every skill Elizabeth had learned in Silverton. The cabin, though structurally sound, required extensive repairs from the Bushwhacker attack. Broken windows needed boarding until glass could be obtained from town. Bullet holes in the walls required patching against the coming winter, and the entire interior needed scrubbing to remove bloodstains and the chaos left by the searchers. Elizabeth threw herself into the work with a determination that surprised even her. Each morning she rose before dawn to milk the 2 cows that had wandered back to the barn, collected eggs from the nervous chickens, and prepared breakfast for herself and Daniel. Then came the harder tasks, mending torn clothing, reinforcing damaged doors, and learning to operate the cast-iron stove that would be their lifeline through the winter months. Daniel, despite his healing shoulder, proved to be a patient teacher and surprisingly good company. Unlike Thomas's formal letters, Daniel's conversation was direct and often laced with dry humor that helped lighten the exhausting work. "You're getting the hang of that axe," he observed on the 3rd day, as Elizabeth, split kindling with growing confidence. "Few more weeks, and you'll be ready to take on those ponderosa pines." "I think I'll leave the giant trees to men with 2 working arms," Elizabeth replied, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the crisp October air. But beneath their growing camaraderie lay constant tension. Every horse's whinny in the distance made them freeze and listen. Every crack of a branch in the surrounding forest sent Daniel's hand toward the rifle he now carried constantly. The Bushwhackers remained at large, and both Elizabeth and Daniel knew the isolated ranch made them vulnerable targets. The vulnerability became stark reality on their 6th day at the ranch. Elizabeth was hanging laundry behind the cabin when she heard Daniel's sharp whistle, the signal they had agreed upon. For immediate danger, she dropped the wet clothes and ran toward the cabin, her heart pounding as she spotted what had alarmed him. 3 riders sat their horses on the ridge above the ranch, silhouetted against the morning sky. Even from a distance, their posture conveyed menace as they studied the property below. They remained motionless for several long minutes, clearly assessing the situation before turning and disappearing back over the ridge. "Were those the same men?" Elizabeth asked as she and Daniel watched from behind the cabin's thick walls. "Hard to tell from this distance, but I'd bet money on it." Daniel checked his rifle's load for the 3rd time that morning. "They're scouting, seeing who's here and how well we're prepared. What do we do?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, weighing their limited options. "We get ready for them to come back, and we hope they decide we're not worth the trouble." That afternoon, Daniel began what he called fortifying for siege. He showed Elizabeth how to create defensive positions inside the cabin, moving furniture, to provide cover and clear fields of fire. Together, they inventoried their ammunition, enough for a short fight, but not a prolonged battle. "The advantage of this cabin," Daniel explained as he pointed out the thick log walls, "is that it's built like a fort. Tom chose this design specifically for protection. Those logs will stop most rifle shots, and we have good views in all directions." Elizabeth learned to load rifles quickly, practiced moving between firing positions without exposing herself to windows, and memorized the locations of spare ammunition and medical supplies. The domestic skills she had been developing, cooking, cleaning, tending animals, suddenly seemed less important than the ability to defend her life. The waiting was almost worse than active danger. Every night brought sounds that might be wind, or might be men moving through the darkness. Every day required constant vigilance while trying to maintain the ranch's normal operations. Elizabeth found herself sleeping fitfully, the rifle Daniel had given her always within arm's reach. But the Bushwhackers' next move, when it came, was not the direct attack they had been expecting. On the 10th day at the ranch, Elizabeth rode to the north pasture to check on the cattle and found something that made her blood run cold. 3 of their best steers were missing, and the fence had been cut with wire cutters. "They're trying to provoke us," Daniel said grimly when she reported the theft. "They want us to come after them, leave the cabin's protection where they can ambush us in the open. So we just let them steal our cattle." Elizabeth's voice carried frustration and growing anger. "Those steers are worth maybe $60. Our lives are worth more than that." Daniel's tone was reasonable, but Elizabeth could see the anger burning in his eyes as well. "They're testing us, seeing how we'll react." The psychological pressure was deliberate and effective. Elizabeth found herself jumping at every sound, scanning the ridges constantly for watchers, and struggling to concentrate on necessary tasks. The peaceful mountain valley Thomas had described in his letters had become a prison where they were constantly under observation by hostile eyes. The harassment escalated over the following days. More fences were cut, allowing cattle to scatter into the forest where they might be killed by predators or stolen more easily. A water trough was sabotaged, forcing Elizabeth and Daniel to carry water by hand until repairs could be made. Most ominously, they began finding signs that someone was approaching the cabin at night. Footprints in the soft earth around the buildings, a window shutter left slightly ajar when they were certain it had been closed. "They're trying to break our nerves," Daniel said after finding fresh boot prints near the chicken coop, "make us so scared and exhausted that we'll make mistakes or abandon the place entirely." Elizabeth understood the strategy, but understanding didn't make it less effective. The constant tension was wearing her down, making every task more difficult and every night a trial of strained nerves and interrupted sleep. The situation reached a breaking point 2 weeks after their arrival at the ranch. Elizabeth was returning from the barn after evening chores when she saw a flicker of movement near the cabin's back door. For a moment, she thought it might be Daniel, but he was supposed to be inside preparing dinner. Moving carefully to get a better view, Elizabeth saw a man crouched beside the back steps, working at something with his hands. He was dressed in dark clothing and wore a hat pulled low over his face, but she could see the glint of metal in his hands, a knife, or possibly a gun. Elizabeth's training took over before conscious thought could interfere. She raised her rifle, aimed carefully at the figure's center mass, and called out in the steadiest voice she could manage, "Stop what you're doing and step away from the cabin." The man spun toward her voice, and Elizabeth caught a glimpse of a bearded face twisted with surprise and anger. Instead of surrendering, he lunged toward her, raising what she now saw was a large knife. Elizabeth fired. The rifle's kick nearly knocked her backward, and the sound echoed through the valley like thunder. The man staggered, clutched his side, and then turned and ran toward the forest, moving with the desperate speed of someone wounded, but not mortally. Daniel burst from the cabin's front door, his own rifle ready. "Elizabeth, are you hurt?" "I'm "Fine," she called back, though her hands were shaking violently. "There was a man by the back door. I shot him, but he got away." Daniel quickly checked the area where the intruder had been working and found a small bundle of dynamite with a fuse attached. "He was planning to blow out the back wall," Daniel said grimly. "Probably meant to create an opening for his partners to storm through." The implications were terrifying. If Elizabeth hadn't returned from the barn when she did, if she hadn't spotted the saboteur, they might have been killed in their sleep or overwhelmed by attackers pouring through a breached wall. "You saved our lives," Daniel said quietly, looking at Elizabeth with new respect. That took real courage. Elizabeth didn't feel courageous. She felt sick to her stomach and shaky with adrenaline. But she also felt something else, a fierce pride in her ability to protect herself and Daniel when the moment demanded it. The frightened city woman who had stepped off the train in Silverton was becoming someone harder and more capable. That night, neither of them slept. They took turns standing watch, listening for any sounds that might indicate another attack. But the valley remained quiet, except for the normal sounds of wind and wildlife. In the morning, they found blood drops, leading from the cabin toward the forest, confirming that Elizabeth's shot had found its mark. But there was no sign of a body, suggesting the wound wasn't fatal. "He'll be back," Daniel said as they examined the blood trail. "Wounded men get desperate, and desperate men do unpredictable things." Elizabeth nodded, accepting this reality with a calmness that would have surprised her former self. "Then we'll be ready for him." But the wounded bushwhackers' next move proved to be more cunning than either of them anticipated. 2 days later, Ben Patterson arrived at the ranch with news that made their blood run cold. "Ruth's been taken," Ben said without preamble, his face gray with worry and exhaustion. "3 men hit our place yesterday morning, took her and some supplies, left a message saying they want to trade her for you, Elizabeth." Elizabeth felt the ground seem to shift beneath her feet. Ruth Patterson, who'd been nothing but kind and helpful, was now a captive because of Elizabeth's presence at the ranch. "What did the message say exactly?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with anger. Ben pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "Says here, trade the Eastern woman for the rancher's wife. Come alone to Devil's Canyon at sunset tomorrow, or Ruth Patterson dies." Elizabeth read the crude message with growing horror. She had never heard of Devil's Canyon, but the ultimatum was clear. Ruth's life hung in the balance because Elizabeth had chosen to stay at the ranch and fight rather than flee. "It's obviously a trap," Daniel said. "They figure you'll go to save Ruth and then they'll have both of you." "Maybe," Elizabeth replied quietly, "but if I don't go, Ruth dies because of me." Ben Patterson's weathered face was etched with desperation. "Miss Harper, I don't know what to do. Ruth's been my wife for 22 years. I can't lose her, but I can't ask you to sacrifice yourself either." Elizabeth looked between the 2 men, seeing her own terrible dilemma reflected in their faces. Every choice led to potential tragedy. If she surrendered herself to save Ruth, she would likely die, and Daniel would be left alone to face the bushwhackers' continued harassment. If she refused, an innocent woman would die because of Elizabeth's decisions. "There might be another way," Daniel said slowly. "What if we don't play by their rules?" Elizabeth looked at him questioningly, seeing something forming in his expression that was both hopeful and dangerous. "What if instead of you going alone to Devil's Canyon, we hunt them down first?" Daniel's voice carried a hard edge she hadn't heard before. "Find where they're holding Ruth and take the fight to them, instead of waiting for them to come to us." The plan was risky, beyond measure. They would be abandoning their defensive position to track armed killers through unfamiliar mountains. But Elizabeth realized that their current strategy, waiting and reacting to the bushwhackers' moves, had failed. The enemy was setting the terms of engagement, choosing when and how to strike, while Elizabeth and Daniel remained trapped and reactive. How? Would we even find them? Elizabeth asked. I know this country, Daniel replied. There are only so many places they could hide and still watch our movements, and that blood trail from the other night might lead us right to them. Elizabeth felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Everything she had gained, her growing confidence, her partnership with Daniel, her sense of belonging in this harsh but beautiful place, hung in the balance. But Ruth Patterson's life mattered more than Elizabeth's personal transformation. All. Right, she said finally. We go after them, but we do it smart and we do it right, because if we fail, we all die. Ben Patterson nodded grimly, understanding that this was their only real chance. I'm coming with you. Ruth's my wife, and I know how to handle myself in a fight. As they began planning their desperate rescue mission, Elizabeth realized that the woman who had arrived in Silverton 3 weeks earlier no longer existed. In her place stood someone harder, more determined, and willing to risk everything for the people she had come to care about. The Bushwhackers had wanted to break her spirit and drive her away. Instead, they had forged her into something they would soon regret encountering in the mountains they thought they controlled. The blood trail from Elizabeth's wounded attacker led deep into the pine forests above the ranch, winding through rocky terrain that grew increasingly treacherous as they climbed toward the high country. Elizabeth, Daniel, and Ben Patterson moved in single file through the pre-dawn darkness, their horses picking their way carefully along game trails that seemed to vanish and reappear without warning. Elizabeth had never tracked men through wilderness before, but Daniel proved to be as skilled at reading signs as he was at ranch work. He could distinguish between the blood drops from the wounded bushwhacker and the older tracks of wildlife, following a trail that would have been invisible to Elizabeth's untrained eyes. He's moving toward Widow's Peak, Daniel whispered as they paused at a rocky outcropping to study the terrain ahead. There's an old mining camp up there, which has been abandoned for 3 years. Perfect place to hole up. Ben Patterson, his face haggard with worry and lack of sleep, checked his rifle for the 10th time. How much farther? Maybe 2 miles, but it gets steep from here. We'll have to leave the horses and go on foot. Daniel pointed toward a series of switchbacks carved into the mountainside, and we'll have to be quiet. Sound carries in these mountains. Elizabeth felt her stomach tighten with a mixture of fear and anticipation. In a few hours she would either help rescue Ruth Patterson or die in the attempt. The woman who had stepped off the train in Silverton would never have imagined herself preparing for armed combat in the Colorado wilderness, but that woman seemed like a stranger now. They secured their horses in a hidden grove and began the final ascent on foot, carrying only their weapons, ammunition, and basic supplies. The thin mountain air made every step an effort, and Elizabeth found herself breathing hard as they climbed through terrain that grew more forbidding with each passing hour. The abandoned mining camp, when they finally spotted it through the trees, looked like something from a nightmare. Ramshackle buildings clung to the mountainside at impossible angles, connected by narrow boardwalks that had partially collapsed over the years. Most of the structures were slowly being reclaimed by the forest, but smoke rising from one cabin indicated recent occupation. There, Daniel pointed to the cabin with the smoking chimney. That's where they'll be. Elizabeth studied the layout of the camp, noting the defensive advantages and disadvantages. The buildings were positioned to be difficult to approach without being seen, but they also offered limited escape routes if the occupants needed to flee quickly. "How do we know Ruth is in there?" Elizabeth asked quietly. Ben answered by pointing to a makeshift clothesline strung between 2 buildings. Among the men's clothing hanging there was a blue dress that Elizabeth recognized as one of Ruth's. "She's there," Ben said grimly. "Question is, how do we get her out?" Daniel studied the camp for several minutes before outlining his plan. There's a back approach through those fallen logs. If Elizabeth can get into position there, she can cover our retreat once we get Ruth. Ben and I will approach from opposite sides, create a distraction, and try to force them to divide their attention. Elizabeth felt a chill at being assigned. The covering position. It meant she would be separated from Daniel and Ben, alone in the wilderness if something went wrong. But she also understood the logic. She was the best shot of the three, and the covering position was crucial to everyone's survival. "What if there are more than 3 men?" she asked. "Then we improvise," Daniel replied. "But we have to try. Ruth's been captive for 2 days. Every hour we wait increases the chance they'll move her somewhere we can't track." As they prepared to separate and take their positions, Ben Patterson gripped Elizabeth's hand briefly. "Miss Harper, I can't ever repay what you're doing for Ruth and me." "You don't need to," Elizabeth replied. "Ruth helped me when I had nowhere to turn. Now it's my turn to help her." Elizabeth made her way through the fallen timber toward her. Assigned position, moving as quietly as possible through the deadfall and undergrowth. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot to her ears, and she found herself holding her breath for long stretches to avoid making noise. Her position, when she finally reached it, provided a clear view of the main cabin's back door and windows. Through a gap in the chinked logs, she could see movement inside, at least 2 men and a figure in blue that had to be Ruth Patterson. Elizabeth settled herself behind a massive fallen pine trunk and checked her rifle's sights. Daniel had taught her to shoot accurately at this distance, but target practice was very different from aiming at human beings. She tried to calm her racing heart and focus on the mechanical aspects of shooting: breathing, sight alignment, trigger. Control. A bird call from the forest to her left signaled that Daniel was in position. A similar call from the right indicated Ben was ready. Elizabeth responded with the agreed-upon signal, and the rescue attempt began. Daniel appeared at the edge of the clearing, moving boldly toward the cabin's front door. His strategy was simple, but dangerous: draw the Bushwhackers' attention and force them to react, creating opportunities for Ben to approach from another angle. "You in the cabin," Daniel called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "I've got something you want. Let's talk." The response was immediate. The cabin's front door burst open and 2 men emerged with rifles raised. Elizabeth recognized one as the bearded man she had wounded. His left arm was held stiffly against his side, confirming her shot had found its mark. "Daniel Caldwell," the wounded man shouted. "Should have known you'd come after us. Where's that Easton bitch who shot me?" "Safe and sound," Daniel replied, keeping his rifle ready but not immediately threatening. "I'm here to discuss an exchange." While the 2 men focused on Daniel, Ben Patterson crept toward the cabin's side window. Elizabeth watched him move with the careful precision of an experienced hunter, using every bit of cover to avoid detection. But the Bushwhackers were more alert than expected. A 3rd man appeared around the cabin's corner, spotting Ben before he could reach the window. "Jack, we got another one!" The situation exploded into chaos. Ben dove for cover as the 3rd Bushwhacker fired, splintering wood from the cabin's wall inches from Ben's head. Daniel immediately raised his rifle and shot the man who had spotted Ben, dropping him with a cry of pain and surprise. Elizabeth found herself with a clear shot at the wounded leader as he turned to fire at Daniel. Time seemed to slow as she lined up her sights on the man's chest. For a moment she hesitated. Shooting someone trying to kill her was one thing, but this felt like cold-blooded execution. Then she saw the bearded man's rifle swinging toward Daniel, who was exposed in the clearing with nowhere to take cover. Elizabeth's hesitation vanished. She pulled the trigger. Her shot took the Bushwhacker high in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. He collapsed against the cabin's doorframe, cursing and clutching his new wound. The remaining Bushwhacker, a young man who looked barely out of his teens, found himself facing 3 armed opponents with his companions down. His nerve broke completely. "Don't shoot," he screamed, throwing his rifle aside and raising his hands. "I surrender. Don't kill me." "Where's the woman?" Ben demanded, advancing on the terrified young man with his rifle trained on the boy's chest. "Inside. She's tied up but alive. We weren't going to hurt her, just use her for trade." Daniel kept his rifle trained on the wounded leader while Ben rushed into the cabin. Elizabeth moved from her position to help secure the area, her heart still pounding from the brief but intense firefight. Ruth Patterson emerged from the cabin supported by her husband, looking exhausted and frightened, but apparently unharmed. When she saw Elizabeth approaching with a rifle in her hands, her eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been pride. "Elizabeth Harper," Ruth said weakly, "you look like you've found your calling." But their relief was premature. As Ben helped Ruth toward the forest edge where they had planned to retreat, the wounded leader managed to reach a pistol he had concealed in his boot. Elizabeth saw the movement from the corner of her eye and shouted a warning, just as the man raised the weapon toward Ruth's back. Elizabeth's third shot of the day was her most crucial. The bullet caught the bushwhacker in the chest just as he fired, spoiling his aim and sending his shot wild. He fell backward into the cabin's doorway and lay still. The sudden silence that followed the gunfire was deafening. Elizabeth stood over the fallen man, her rifle still smoking, and realized she had just killed another human being. The weight of that knowledge hit her like a physical blow, making her knees weak and her hands shake. Daniel appeared beside her, gently taking the rifle from her trembling hands. "It's over," he said quietly. "You did what you had to do." But Elizabeth knew it wasn't over. Not really. The young bushwhacker who had surrendered was babbling about other men, about a larger organization that had been targeting isolated ranches throughout the territory. The three men they had faced were apparently just one group in a network of criminals that stretched across the region. "There's more of them," the boy gasped, desperate to trade information for his life. "Whole gang working out of a hideout near Durango. They got plans to hit every ranch in the valley before winter." Daniel and Ben exchanged grim looks. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. As they prepared to leave the mining camp with their prisoner, Elizabeth took one last look at the bodies of the men she had helped kill. She felt no satisfaction in their deaths, only a hollow sense of necessity fulfilled. These men had chosen violence and paid the ultimate price for that choice. But she also felt something else, a cold certainty that she could kill again if necessary to protect the people she cared about. The transformation that had begun with her decision to leave Boston was complete. She was no longer the helpless woman who had stepped off the train in Silverton. The descent from the mining camp was treacherous, made more difficult by Ruth's weakness and the need to guard their prisoner. Elizabeth found herself constantly scanning the surrounding forest, knowing that other members of the criminal network might be nearby. "We need to get word to the territorial authorities," Ben said as they reached their horses. "This is bigger than local law can handle." Daniel nodded, but his expression was troubled. "That'll take time, and winter's coming fast. If there's a whole gang planning to hit the valley, they'll want to finish their work before the snows trap them." Elizabeth understood the implications. Even with their immediate attackers dead or captured, the larger threat remained. The isolated ranches and small communities of the San Juan Mountains were still vulnerable to organized criminals who could strike and disappear into the vast wilderness. As they rode back toward the Caldwell Ranch, Elizabeth found herself thinking not about the violence she had witnessed and participated in, but about what came next. She had proven she could fight and kill when necessary, but the question remained, what kind of life could she build in a place where such violence was a constant possibility? Ruth Patterson, riding beside her husband with obvious relief at being free, seemed to sense Elizabeth's thoughts. "You saved my life today," she said quietly. "More than that, you've probably saved other lives too. Don't let what you had to do eat away at you." Elizabeth nodded, but she knew the memory of taking human life would stay with her forever. The mountains had tested her in ways she could never have imagined, and she had passed those tests. But the price of survival in this beautiful, dangerous land was higher than she had ever expected to pay. As the ranch buildings came into view below them, Elizabeth realized that her choice was no longer whether to stay or leave. It was whether to continue fighting for the life she was building here, or let the violence and isolation drive her away from the only place she had ever truly felt at home. The Bushwhackers had wanted to break her spirit and claim her land. Instead, they had forged her into someone strong enough to stand against them. But Elizabeth wondered if she was strong enough to live with the consequences of what she had become. Word of the Bushwhacker attack and Ruth Patterson's rescue spread through the San Juan Valley like wildfire. Within 2 days of their return from the abandoned mining camp, the Caldwell Ranch became an unlikely headquarters for what was rapidly becoming a regional uprising against organized crime. The captured bushwhacker, a 19-year-old named Jimmy Morse, proved to be a treasure trove of information once he realized cooperation might save his neck from a hanging rope. Under questioning by Daniel and several other ranchers who had ridden to the Caldwell place, Jimmy revealed the scope of the criminal organization that had been terrorizing the territory. "There's maybe 20 of them all told," Jimmy said, his voice shaking as he sat bound to a chair in the Caldwell cabin while a dozen armed men listened to his confession. "Led by a man named Colonel Briggs. He ain't really a colonel, just likes the title. Used to be a Confederate officer, but the war broke his mind, I think." Elizabeth listened from the kitchen area, where she was preparing coffee for the growing crowd of ranchers, merchants, and even a few miners who had come to hear Jimmy's story. She had insisted on continuing her domestic duties despite the men's protests, partly to maintain some normalcy and partly because she found the familiar tasks helped calm her nerves after the violence at the mining camp. "Where's their main hideout?" demanded Frank Miller, a cattle rancher whose spread had been hit 3 weeks earlier. "We aim to finish this before they can scatter." Jimmy swallowed hard, clearly torn between fear of his former associates and terror of the rope that awaited him if he didn't cooperate. "There's an old Spanish mine about 15 miles south of Durango, hidden in a box canyon. Briggs calls it. For defiance, they got supplies, ammunition, even some stolen cavalry equipment." Daniel looked up from the rough map he was sketching based on Jimmy's information. "How many approaches to this canyon?" "Just one that I know of. Narrow trail that winds up through the rocks. Easy to defend, hard to attack." Jimmy's voice grew more confident as he realized his information was valuable. "But there's another way, an old mine shaft that connects to some natural caves. Comes out about a quarter mile from their camp." Elizabeth felt a chill as she realized what the men were planning. They weren't just gathering information about the criminal organization, they were preparing to attack it directly. The violence that had already claimed so many lives was about to escalate into what amounted to a private war. Over the following days, the Caldwell Ranch transformed into a military camp. Ranchers arrived with their hired hands, bringing weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The territorial sheriff, a competent man named Marcus Wade, who had ridden down from the county seat, brought legal authority and tactical experience from his Army days. "This Colonel Briggs has been operating across 3 counties, Sheriff Wade explained to the assembled group during one of their evening planning sessions. "Federal marshals are spread too thin to handle it, and by the time we could get Army support, winter will have locked down the high country. If we're going to act, it has to be now." Elizabeth found herself drawn into the planning despite her lack of military experience. Her actions at the mining camp had earned her a respect among the men that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. When questions arose about logistics, medical preparation, or the care of wounded. The men turned to her for answers. "Miss Harper," Sheriff Wade said during one such discussion, "you've seen these criminals in action. What's your assessment of their capabilities?" Elizabeth considered the question carefully, remembering the disciplined way the Bushwhackers had conducted their harassment campaign and the professional manner in which they had fortified the mining camp. "They're not ordinary criminals," she said finally. "They plan their operations carefully, they know the terrain, and they're willing to kill without hesitation. But they also showed poor discipline under pressure." The young one panicked immediately. "When his leaders were shot, meaning what?" asked Ben Patterson, who had become one of the most vocal advocates for immediate action. "Meaning they're dangerous when they have the initiative, but they might fold quickly if we can disrupt their command structure and put them on the defensive." Sheriff Wade nodded approvingly. "That matches my assessment. Hit them hard and fast, take out their leadership, and the rest will likely surrender or scatter." The plan that emerged from days of discussion was ambitious and risky. The main force, led by Sheriff Wade and including most of the experienced fighters, would assault the canyon entrance to fix the defenders in place. Meanwhile, a smaller group would use Jimmy's information about the mine shaft to infiltrate behind the criminal camp and attack from an unexpected direction. Elizabeth was assigned to the infiltration team over the strong objections of several men who felt the dangerous mission had no place for a woman. But Daniel supported her inclusion, pointing out that she had proven her courage and shooting ability, and that the team needed every skilled fighter available. "Besides," Daniel added during one heated discussion, "Elizabeth knows these particular criminals better than anyone except Jimmy. She's fought them twice and won both times." The debate over Elizabeth's role revealed deeper tensions within the group about women's capabilities and proper roles on the frontier. Some of the older ranchers clearly believed that women should be protected rather than included in combat operations, while younger men who had seen Elizabeth's marksmanship were more willing to judge her by her abilities rather than her sex. Elizabeth ended the debate by stating her position clearly. "I'm going because this is my fight as much as anyone's. These men killed my intended husband, attacked my home, and kidnapped my friend. I'm not asking for permission. I'm informing you of my decision." The force that departed the Caldwell Ranch on a crisp November morning included 37 men and one woman, armed with everything from military rifles to hunting shotguns. They traveled in small groups to avoid detection, planning to rendezvous near Durango before making the final approach to the criminals' hideout. Elizabeth rode with Daniel, Sheriff Wade, and 3 other men who comprised the infiltration team. Jimmy Morse, under heavy guard, would guide them to the mine entrance before being secured with the horses during the actual assault. The journey to Durango took 2 days through an increasingly wild country. Elizabeth found herself thinking not about the coming battle, but about how dramatically her life had changed in just 2 months. She had left Boston as a woman seeking security through marriage. Now she was riding toward armed combat as an equal partner in a frontier community's fight for survival. The Spanish mine that Jimmy led them to was indeed well hidden, its entrance concealed behind fallen rocks and overgrown with decades of vegetation. The shaft descended steeply into darkness that seemed to swallow their lantern light, and Elizabeth felt her stomach clench with claustrophobia as they began the dangerous descent. "Mine's been abandoned for maybe 40 years, Jimmy whispered, as they made their way through the narrow tunnel. "Some sections ain't too stable, so watch for loose timbers and rockfalls." The underground journey took nearly an hour, following a route that twisted through natural caverns connected by hand-carved passages. Elizabeth's respect for the Spanish miners who had created this underground maze grew with every step. The work must have been incredibly dangerous, yet they had persevered in their search for silver and gold. When they finally emerged from the cave system, Elizabeth found herself looking down into a box canyon that matched Jimmy's description perfectly. The criminal camp was spread across the canyon floor about a quarter-mile away, with buildings, corrals, and defensive positions clearly visible in the afternoon sunlight. "Count the sentries," Daniel whispered, studying the camp through a pair of field glasses. "I see 4 on the rim, 2 at the main entrance." Sheriff Wade took the glasses and made his own assessment. "Looks like most of them are in camp. Good timing. They're not expecting trouble." Elizabeth watched the distant figures moving around the camp and felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. In a few hours, many of those men would be dead, and she would probably be responsible for killing some of them. The thought no longer frightened her as it once would have, but it carried a weight of responsibility that she was still learning to bear. The signal for the assault came just before sunset, 3 quick rifle shots from the canyon entrance indicating that Sheriff Wade's main force was in position. Daniel raised his own rifle and fired a single shot at the nearest sentry, dropping the man from his rocky perch and announcing the infiltration team's presence. What followed was 20 minutes of concentrated violence that seemed to stretch for hours. Elizabeth found herself firing steadily at targets of opportunity, while Daniel and the others advanced methodically through the camp, driving the surviving criminals toward the canyon entrance, where the main force waited. The criminals' resistance collapsed faster than anyone had expected. Caught between 2 forces and deprived of their defensive positions, most threw down their weapons and surrendered within the first few minutes. Only a small group around the command tent continued fighting, led by a tall man with a grey beard who Elizabeth assumed was the notorious Colonel Briggs. The final confrontation came when Briggs and 3 of his remaining men barricaded themselves in a stone building that had probably been the mine's original office. Sheriff Wade called for their surrender, but Briggs responded with curses and threats that indicated he had no intention of being taken alive. "He knows he'll hang," Daniel said quietly as they crouched behind cover outside the building. "Man like that would rather go down fighting than face a rope." The standoff might have continued for hours, but Elizabeth noticed something the men had missed, a back window of the stone building that was partially concealed by a pile of mining equipment. From her position, she had a clear shot at anyone who tried to escape through that route. When Colonel Briggs finally made his desperate bid for freedom, slipping out the back window while his remaining men provided covering fire from the front, Elizabeth was ready. Her shot took him in the leg, sending him sprawling in the dirt, where Sheriff Wade's men quickly surrounded him. "Colonel Briggs," Sheriff Wade announced formally, "you're under arrest for murder, robbery, conspiracy, and crimes against the territory of Colorado." Briggs, clutching his wounded leg and glaring at his captors with undimmed hatred, spat in the dirt. "This ain't over. There's others who'll take up where I left off." "Maybe," Sheriff Wade replied calmly, "but they'll know what happened to you, and they'll think twice about operating in this territory." As the surviving criminals were secured and preparations began for the journey back to face justice, Elizabeth found herself standing at the edge of the box canyon, looking out over the mountains that had become her home. The violence was over. The threat ended, but she felt no sense of triumph, only a weary satisfaction that the job was done. Daniel appeared beside her, his rifle slung across his shoulder and his face showing the exhaustion that followed intense combat. "It's finished," he said simply. "This part is finished," Elizabeth replied, "but there's still the question of what comes next." Daniel was quiet for a moment, understanding that she was talking about more than just the aftermath of their victory over the criminals. "What do you want to do next?" Elizabeth considered the question, thinking about the woman she had been and the woman she had become. "I want to help build something lasting here, something worth fighting for. Even after everything that's happened," Even knowing what life is like in this country, Elizabeth smiled, feeling a certainty she hadn't experienced since leaving Boston. Especially because of everything that's happened. I know now what I'm capable of, what this place can make of someone who's willing to change and grow. As the sun set behind the canyon walls and the victorious expedition prepared for the journey home, Elizabeth Harper stood with Daniel Caldwell and watched their new world settle into peaceful twilight. The battles were over, but the real work, building a life and community worth defending, was just beginning. The mail-order bride, who had come to Colorado seeking security, had found something far more valuable, the strength to create her own destiny and the community to share it with. The mountains had tested her in ways she could never have imagined, and she had emerged not just unbroken, but transformed into someone she was proud to be. 3 weeks after the destruction of Colonel Briggs's criminal organization, Elizabeth Harper stood in the kitchen of the Caldwell Ranch, watching the first heavy snows of winter begin to fall. The flakes came down steadily, already beginning to accumulate on the fence posts and barn roof, promising to soon seal the mountain valleys until spring. But unlike her anxious vigil during the Bushwhacker siege, Elizabeth felt only peace as she watched the weather transform the landscape into a pristine white wonderland. The trials and danger that had defined her first months in Colorado Territory were over. Colonel Briggs and his surviving followers had been transported to Denver for trial, where federal authorities promised they would face justice for their crimes across multiple territories. The threat that had haunted isolated ranches throughout the San Juan Mountains had been eliminated through community cooperation and collective courage. But for Elizabeth, the end of external danger had brought internal questions she was only beginning to confront. With the criminal threat removed and winter settling over the land, she found herself facing decisions about her future that would determine not just where she lived, but who she would become in the years ahead. The most immediate question involved her relationship with Daniel Caldwell. Over the past month, their partnership had evolved from necessity into something deeper and more complex. They worked together seamlessly, anticipated each other's needs, and shared a comfortable intimacy, born of shared danger and mutual respect. Yet neither had spoken directly about their feelings or made any formal commitment beyond their current arrangement. Daniel entered the kitchen carrying an armload of split wood, his boots tracking snow across the floor Elizabeth had just cleaned. A month earlier, such casual disregard for domestic order would have irritated her. Now she simply handed him a towel and helped stack the wood beside the stove. "Storm's setting in hard," Daniel said, brushing snow from his dark hair. "Could last 3 days, maybe more. Good thing we got the cattle moved to the lower pasture when we did." Elizabeth nodded, understanding that winter weather in the mountains was not just an inconvenience, but a potentially deadly force that demanded constant preparation and respect. She had learned to read the signs, wind patterns, cloud formations, the behavior of animals that warned of severe storms days in advance. "Daniel," she said, suddenly finding courage to voice thoughts she had been carrying for weeks, "we need to talk about what happens when spring comes." Daniel paused in his wood stacking, and Elizabeth saw something cautious enter his expression. "What do you mean?" "I mean we need to decide what this is." Elizabeth gestures between them, encompassing their shared work, their comfortable domesticity, and the unspoken emotional connection that had grown between them. Are we partners running a ranch together? Are we something more? Are we just two people who helped each other survive a difficult situation? Daniel straightened slowly, his blue eyes studying her face with the same intensity he brought to tracking games or reading weather signs. "What do you want it to be?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities and fears. Elizabeth had learned that frontier life demanded directness in all things. There was no room for the elaborate courtship rituals and social pretenses that had governed relationships in Boston. Here, people said what they meant, and meant what they said, because survival often depended on clear communication and honest dealing. "I want it to be a marriage," Elizabeth said simply. "Not because convention demands it, not because I need protection or security, but because I love you and want to build a life with you." Daniel's face broke into a smile that transformed his usually serious features into something warm and wonderful. "Elizabeth Harper, you never stop surprising me. Most women would wait for the man to propose." "I'm not most women," Elizabeth replied, feeling a familiar surge of independence and determination. "I'm a woman who's learned to go after what she wants instead of waiting for it to come to her." Daniel crossed the kitchen in 2 quick strides and gathered Elizabeth into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around the small room. When he set her down, his expression was serious again, but his eyes shone with happiness. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes to marriage, yes to building a life together, yes to everything." He paused, suddenly looking uncertain. "But Elizabeth, there's something I need to tell you first, something about Tom." Elizabeth felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. Throughout all their trials, Daniel had never spoken much about his missing brother, and she had assumed Thomas was dead. The possibility that he might still be alive somewhere, injured, captive, or simply lost, had haunted her, even as her feelings for Daniel deepened. "What about Thomas?" she asked quietly. Daniel led her to the kitchen table and sat down across from her, his hands clasped tightly together. "Tom's alive, Elizabeth. He has been all along." The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the table, her mind reeling with implications. "Alive where? Why haven't you told me?" "He's in Denver, recovering from injuries he sustained during the Bushwhacker attack. A family traveling through found him unconscious near Mineral Creek the day after the raid. He had a head wound and no memory of who he was or where he came from. They took him to Denver for medical care." Elizabeth struggled to process this information. "How long have you known?" "Sheriff Wade told me just before we attacked the criminal camp. Tom's memory started returning about 2 weeks ago, and he sent word through the territorial authorities. Wade thought I should finish the business with Briggs before dealing with personal matters." Elizabeth felt a surge of anger at being kept in the dark about something so important, followed immediately by confusion about what Thomas's survival meant for her relationship with Daniel. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" Daniel's expression was painful but honest. "Because I was afraid of what it would mean. Tom wrote you letters, made promises, had plans for a life with you. I couldn't compete with that, couldn't ask you to choose between the man you came here to marry and the man you'd only known through necessity." Elizabeth stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the falling snow, while her mind struggled with this new reality. Thomas Caldwell, the thoughtful, considerate man whose letters had convinced her to leave Boston, was alive and presumably expecting to resume the relationship they had built through correspondence. But that relationship belonged to the woman Elizabeth had been, not the woman she had become. The frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off the train in Silverton no longer existed. In her place stood someone harder, more self-reliant, and shaped by experiences Thomas had never shared. "What does Thomas expect?" she asked without turning from the window. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "His letter was brief, just that his memory had returned and he was asking about your welfare. He doesn't know about everything that's happened, about the Bushwhackers or our arrangement." Elizabeth turned back to face Daniel, studying the man she had fallen in love with through shared hardship and mutual respect. He was offering to step aside, to honor his brother's prior claim, even though it would clearly break his heart. The nobility of the gesture only strengthened her certainty about her choice. "Daniel," she said firmly. "I came to Colorado to marry Thomas Caldwell, but that was before I knew who I really was or what I was capable of becoming. The woman who answered Thomas's letters doesn't exist anymore. The woman standing here now chooses you." Relief flooded Daniel's features, followed quickly by concern. "Elizabeth, you need to be sure. Tom's a good man, probably a better man than me in many ways. He can offer you the comfortable life he promised in his letters. I can only offer the life we build together through our own efforts." Elizabeth smiled, feeling the last of her uncertainty fade away. "Daniel Caldwell, comfortable was never what I really wanted. I wanted a life worth living, a partnership worth fighting for, and a love strong enough to survive anything this country can throw at us. That's what we have together." But even as Elizabeth spoke the words, she knew the situation was more complicated than her feelings alone could resolve. Thomas had rights and expectations that couldn't simply be dismissed. He had entered into correspondence with her in good faith, made promises and plans based on her agreement to marry him. Honor demanded that she face him directly and explain her decision, rather than simply disappearing from his life. "I need to see Thomas," Elizabeth said. "I owe him the truth about what's happened and what I've decided. He deserves to hear it. And from me, not learn about it through rumors or second-hand reports." Daniel nodded, understanding her reasoning, even as worry clouded his expression. "The passes will be snowed in for months. Travel to Denver won't be possible until spring." "Then we wait until spring," Elizabeth replied. "We use the winter to plan our life together, and when the snows melt, we'll go to Denver together. I'll explain everything to Thomas, and we can start our marriage with no shadows from the past." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Having declared their intentions openly, Elizabeth and Daniel began living as an engaged couple rather than reluctant partners thrown together by circumstance. The change was subtle but significant. They shared domestic decisions more openly, planned for the future as a unit, and gradually allowed their physical relationship to reflect their emotional commitment. The winter that followed was the happiest time of Elizabeth's life. Snowed in at the ranch with Daniel, she discovered the deep satisfaction of a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and complementary abilities. They spent long evenings reading together, planning improvements to the ranch, and talking about their hopes for the future. Elizabeth taught Daniel to read more fluently. His education had been interrupted by frontier necessities, while he taught her advanced skills in ranching, hunting, and wilderness survival. They expanded the cabin, adding a proper parlor and additional storage space for the business Elizabeth planned to establish as a seamstress serving the scattered ranch families of the valley. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to communicate with the honesty and directness that successful frontier marriages required. Elizabeth discovered that Daniel's quiet nature hid a sharp intelligence and dry humor that matched her own. Daniel learned that Elizabeth's determination and independence made her a stronger partner, not a more difficult one. "You know," Daniel said one evening in February as they sat before the fire planning their spring planting, "I used to think Tom was the lucky one, getting a wife through the mail while I stayed alone on the ranch. Turns out I was the lucky one after all." Elizabeth smiled, looking up from the seed catalog she was studying. "Neither of us was lucky, Daniel. We made choices and worked for what we wanted. Luck is what happens to people who don't take responsibility for their own lives." As winter slowly gave way to spring, preparations began for the journey to Denver. Elizabeth packed carefully, taking gifts for Thomas and legal documents that would formally transfer any claims he might have on her future to Daniel. She also carried letters of recommendation from Sheriff Wade and other territorial officials, documentation of her role in defeating the criminal organization that might help Thomas understand how dramatically she had changed. The trip to Denver took 6 days through mountain passes still treacherous with snow and mud. Elizabeth rode beside Daniel, confident in her horsemanship after months of mountain travel, and marveled at how different this journey felt from her original train ride to Colorado. She was no longer traveling toward an uncertain future with a stranger. She was traveling with her chosen partner to resolve the past and claim the future they had built together. Denver, in April of 1878, was a booming city, far larger and more sophisticated than anything Elizabeth had seen since leaving Boston. The streets bustled with commerce and construction, and the hotels and restaurants showed a level of luxury that seemed almost foreign after months of frontier simplicity. They found Thomas at the Denver House Hotel, where he was staying while conducting business for a mining syndicate that had offered him a position based on his knowledge of the San Juan region. Elizabeth's first sight of him confirmed her memories of the portrait he had sent, tall, brown-haired, with intelligent eyes and a gentle manner that had attracted her to his letters. But seeing Thomas in person also confirmed her certainty about her choice. He was exactly what she had expected, kind, thoughtful, and offering the comfortable life he had promised. What he couldn't offer was the partnership of equals she had found with Daniel, the shared growth through adversity that had forged their relationship. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Elizabeth's life. Thomas listened quietly as she explained everything that had happened since his disappearance, the Bushwhacker attacks, her partnership with Daniel, their growing love, and her decision to marry Daniel instead of him. "I won't pretend I'm not disappointed," Thomas said when she finished. "I had built many dreams around our correspondence and your arrival in Colorado. But Elizabeth, you've described a woman I never knew through letters, someone braver and stronger than I imagined possible. Daniel is fortunate to have won such a woman's love." Elizabeth felt tears sting her eyes at Thomas's grace in accepting her decision. "Thomas, I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you planned or hoped for." "No," Thomas agreed, "but it sounds like it's what you needed to become who you were meant to be. I can't regret that, even if it means losing you to my brother." Thomas stood and shook Daniel's hand formally. "Take care of her, Daniel. She's clearly capable of taking care of herself. But even the strongest people deserve someone who will stand beside them." "I will," Daniel replied simply, "for the rest of my life." Thomas smiled, and Elizabeth saw in his expression both sadness and genuine happiness for their union. "Then I give you both my blessing, and I hope you'll name your first son Thomas." So something of our original plan survives. The wedding took place 3 days later in Denver's First Methodist Church, with Thomas serving as Daniel's best man in a gesture of reconciliation that moved Elizabeth to tears. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, with vows that spoke of partnership, mutual respect, and the determination to build something lasting together. As Elizabeth and Daniel Caldwell left Denver to return to their ranch in the San Juan Mountains, Elizabeth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Colorado as a mail-order bride seeking security, and had found instead the strength to create her own destiny. The mountains that had tested her so severely had become home. The dangers that had threatened to destroy her had forged her into someone she was proud to be. The man she had planned to marry had become a friend and supporter, while the man she had never expected to love had become her true partner. Looking ahead toward the peaks that surrounded their valley, Elizabeth Caldwell felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had faced every challenge life could offer and emerged victorious. She had traveled across a continent to find a new life, and had discovered instead that she could create any life she was strong enough to claim. The mail-order bride, who had stepped off the train in Silverton, no longer existed. In her place rode a frontier woman who had earned her place in this harsh but beautiful land through courage, determination, and the willingness to become whatever circumstances demanded. As their wagon wound through the mountain passes toward home, Elizabeth placed her hand in Daniel's and smiled at the endless possibilities stretching ahead of them. The future was unwritten, full of challenges and opportunities she couldn't yet imagine. But whatever came, she would meet it as Elizabeth Caldwell, a woman who had learned that the greatest adventures come not from seeking comfort, but from finding the courage to become who you were always meant to be. The story that had begun with a desperate woman fleeing an uncertain future in Boston had ended with a confident woman embracing an unlimited future in the Colorado Territory. Elizabeth had found more than a husband. She had found herself, and in doing so, had discovered that she was capable of anything. The return journey to the ranch took on a celebratory air that contrasted sharply with Elizabeth's anxious first trip to Colorado. This time she traveled as Mrs. Daniel Caldwell, a woman who belonged fully to the mountains and valleys she now called home. Fellow travelers they encountered along the trail treated her with the respect accorded to an established rancher's wife, not the curious pity often shown to mail-order brides. At a trading post near the Continental Divide, they encountered Mrs. Catherine Morgan, the widow Elizabeth had met during her original train journey west. Mrs. Morgan was returning from visiting her son's family in Oregon, and her face lit up with recognition and amazement when she saw Elizabeth. "My dear, you look like a completely different person," Mrs. Morgan said, as they shared coffee in the trading post's rough dining room. "When I met you on that train, you seemed like a frightened girl playing at being a woman. Now you carry yourself like someone who's faced the world and conquered it." Elizabeth smiled at the observation, recognizing its truth. The mountains have a way of showing you what you're really made of. Sometimes that's more than you ever expected. And sometimes, Daniel added with obvious pride, it's exactly what the mountains need. Mrs. Morgan's eyes sparkled with understanding as she looked between the newlyweds. "This isn't the man you were originally meant to marry, is it?" "No," Elizabeth replied without embarrassment. "Life had different plans than I did. Better plans, as it turned out." The conversation reminded Elizabeth of how much her perspective had shifted since leaving Boston. The woman who had answered Thomas's advertisement had been seeking escape from uncertainty. The woman who had married Daniel was running toward possibility. The difference in motivation had shaped everything that followed. As they continued their journey home, Daniel shared his own thoughts about their future. "I've been thinking about expanding our operation," he said, as they rode through a high meadow dotted with early wildflowers. "Not just cattle, but horses too. The army's going to need good mounts as they establish more posts in the territory, and civilian demand is growing as more settlers arrive." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense, and I've been thinking about the seamstress work I want to establish. Ruth Patterson mentioned that several rancher wives would pay well for quality dressmaking and alterations. There's a real need for skilled textile work in this region." They spent hours discussing their plans, dreaming aloud about the ranch they would build together and the family they hoped to raise. These conversations revealed a fundamental compatibility that went far beyond their physical attraction or shared experiences. They saw the future in similar terms as something to be shaped through effort and determination, rather than something that simply happened to them. The ranch, when they finally reached it, felt more like home than any place Elizabeth had ever lived. During their absence, Ben and Ruth Patterson had maintained the property and livestock, leaving everything in perfect order for their return. Ruth's embrace when she saw Elizabeth was warm with genuine affection. "Look at you, glowing like a new bride should," Ruth said, holding Elizabeth at arm's length to study her face. "Marriage suits you, though I suspect it's not just the wedding ring that's put that light in your eyes." Elizabeth laughed, feeling the truth of Ruth's observation. "I think it's more that I finally know who I am and what I want. Marriage is wonderful, but it's built on something solid, real partnership, and mutual respect. Over the following months, Elizabeth and Daniel settled into the rhythm of married life while working to expand their ranching operation. The horse breeding program Daniel had envisioned proved immediately successful. His knowledge of bloodlines and conformation, combined with Elizabeth's meticulous record-keeping and business acumen, created a partnership that was both personally satisfying and financially profitable. Elizabeth's seamstress business also flourished beyond her initial expectations. Word of her skills spread throughout the scattered ranching communities, and soon she was receiving orders from women as far away as Durango and Cortez. The work provided not just income, but social connections that helped combat the isolation of ranch life. One of her most rewarding projects came when Sarah Martinez, a young Mexican-American woman whose family had been farming in the valley for generations, asked Elizabeth to design her wedding dress. Sarah's English was limited, but the two women communicated through gestures, sketches, and shared enthusiasm for creating something beautiful. "You understand," Sarah said in careful English, as Elizabeth fitted the intricate lace bodice. "What it means to start a new life in a hard place." Elizabeth paused in her pinning, struck by the insight. "Yes, I think I do. We both chose to build our lives here, in our own ways." "Sigh, but you choose to be brave. I was born here, my family here. You come alone, make everything new." The observation stayed with Elizabeth long after Sarah's wedding, reminding her that her journey represented more than personal transformation. She had become part of a larger story about the courage required to build new communities in challenging places. The arrival of their first child in the spring of 1879 marked another milestone in Elizabeth's evolution. Little Thomas Caldwell, named for his uncle as promised, was born during a late snowstorm that prevented Dr. Henderson from reaching the ranch. Elizabeth found herself delivering her own child with only Daniel and Ruth Patterson in attendance. "You're full of surprises, Elizabeth Caldwell," Ruth said as she helped clean the squalling infant. "Most women would be terrified to give birth without a doctor, but you handled it like you'd been doing it for years." Elizabeth, exhausted but exhilarated, looked down at her son's red face and felt a completion she hadn't known she was seeking. "I suppose I've learned to trust myself to handle whatever comes. This little one will grow up knowing that about his mother." Daniel, who had been pacing nervously throughout the labor, approached the bed with obvious awe. When Elizabeth placed his son in his arms, his expression softened into something so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "He's perfect," Daniel whispered, "and he's got his mother's determination, been fighting to get here through this storm." As spring turned to summer and young Thomas began to thrive, Elizabeth reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. The frightened woman, who had answered a mail-order bride advertisement, would never have imagined herself delivering her own child during a mountain blizzard, running a successful business from a frontier ranch, or helping her husband breed horses for military contracts. The transformation went beyond external circumstances to something fundamental about how she saw herself and her place in the world. In Boston, she had been someone to whom things happened: economic hardship, family deaths, limited opportunities. Here in Colorado, she was someone who made things happen, building businesses, fighting off criminals, shaping her community's future. The difference was profound and permanent. Elizabeth knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, drought, economic downturns, Indian troubles, or simple human conflict, she would face them as an active participant rather than a passive victim. The mountains had taught her that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. This confidence was tested sooner than expected when news arrived that the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad was planning to extend a line through their valley. The development promised to bring prosperity and connection to the outside world, but it also threatened to change forever the isolated community they had worked to build. Some folks are calling it progress, Ben Patterson said during a community meeting at the ranch. Others say it'll bring too many outsiders, too much change too fast. Elizabeth listened to the debate with interest, noting how the discussion divided along predictable lines. Older settlers feared losing the character and independence that had drawn them to the frontier. Younger families saw opportunities for education, commerce, and growth that the railroad would provide. "What do you think, Elizabeth?" asked Jim Wilson, the rancher who had offered help during her first difficult days in Colorado. "You've seen both sides, city life and frontier life. How do we handle this kind of change?" Elizabeth considered the question carefully, understanding that her response would carry weight because of the respect she had earned in the community. "I think change is inevitable, whether we invite it or not. The question is whether we'll shape that change or let it shape us." She paused, organizing her thoughts. "The railroad will come, with or without our approval. But we can decide what kind of community we want it to find here. We can maintain the values that make this place special: self-reliance, mutual support, honest dealing, while embracing the opportunities that connection brings." The discussion that followed led to the formation of a Valley Improvement Association, with Elizabeth serving as secretary and chief correspondent with railroad officials. Her experience with business correspondence and her reputation for fair dealing made her a natural choice for representing the community's interests. The negotiations with the railroad stretched over months, requiring trips to Denver and correspondence with officials in distant cities. Elizabeth found herself drawing on skills she had never known she possessed: diplomacy, financial analysis, and strategic thinking that had been honed through her experiences fighting bushwhackers and building her businesses. When the railroad finally reached their valley in the autumn of 1880, it brought changes that were both challenging and beneficial. New families arrived, some seeking ranch land, and others planning to establish businesses in the growing town of Silverton. The isolated community Elizabeth had joined was becoming part of a larger network of commerce and communication. But the fundamental character of the place remained intact. The harsh environment still demanded strength and adaptability from everyone who chose to stay. The community bonds forged through shared hardship remained strong, even as the population grew and diversified. Elizabeth often stood on her porch in the evenings, watching the trains wind through the valley and marveling at how completely her world had been transformed. The railroad brought reminders of the life she had left behind: newspapers from Boston, luxury goods she had once coveted, letters from acquaintances who still lived the constrained existence she had escaped. Yet none of these connections to her past created any desire to return. Elizabeth Caldwell belonged to the mountains now, to the ranch she and Daniel had built, to the community they helped lead, and to the future they were creating for their children. The realization brought deep satisfaction and a profound sense of gratitude. She had traveled to Colorado seeking security and had found instead the courage to build a life worth living. The frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off the train in Silverton had evolved into a frontier woman who faced each day with confidence and purpose. As winter approached and the first snows began to dust the high peaks, Elizabeth prepared for her second child while managing her growing business and helping Daniel expand their horse breeding operation. The work was demanding, but it was work she had chosen, in a place she loved, with a partner who respected her capabilities and shared her dreams. Standing at her kitchen window, watching Daniel work with a young colt in the corral while their son played safely nearby, Elizabeth felt the deep contentment of someone who had found exactly where they belonged. The journey from Boston to Colorado had been about more than geography. It had been about discovering who she was capable of becoming when circumstances demanded her very best. But even as Elizabeth savored this moment of peace, She knew that frontier life never allowed for complete complacency. The autumn of 1881 brought unexpected challenges that tested both her personal resolve and the community bonds she had helped forge. A severe drought struck the San Juan region that summer, drying up streams and withering the mountain grasses that sustained the valley's growing herbs. Elizabeth watched anxiously as their carefully cultivated hayfields turned brown and brittle, while Daniel and the other ranchers made increasingly difficult decisions about which animals to keep and which to sell before they starved. "We might lose half the breeding stock," Daniel admitted one evening as they reviewed their rapidly dwindling feed supplies. "The army contract won't mean much if we don't have horses to deliver next spring." Elizabeth studied the figures they had calculated and recalculated, searching for solutions that seemed increasingly elusive. "What about the Martinez family's place? They have that high meadow with the spring that never runs dry. Maybe we could arrange some kind of partnership." Daniel looked up with interest. "You mean to approach Carlos about sharing grazing rights?" "That could work, but it would cost us probably a significant share of our future profits." "Better to share profits than lose everything," Elizabeth replied pragmatically. "And it might be the beginning of something bigger. If the drought continues, all the ranchers in the valley will need to cooperate or fail separately." The negotiations with Carlos Martinez proved more complex than Elizabeth had anticipated. Not because Carlos was unwilling to help, but because the arrangement required navigating cultural differences and language barriers that made clear communication challenging. Elizabeth found herself serving as an intermediary, drawing on her relationship with Sarah Martinez and her growing understanding of the valley's Hispanic community. "My father, he remembers when all this land was part of Mexico," Sarah explained, as she helped Elizabeth and her father discuss the grazing arrangement. "He worries that cooperation might become, how do you say, taking over?" Elizabeth understood the concern. The arrival of Anglo ranchers and the territorial government had already displaced some traditional land uses and cultural practices. Carlos Martinez's willingness to negotiate represented both economic necessity and a risk that his family's interests might be overwhelmed by larger, better-financed operations. "Tell your father that we're proposing partnership, not dominance," Elizabeth said carefully. "Our success depends on his success and vice versa. We sink or swim together." The agreement they eventually reached became a model for other drought-stressed ranchers in the valley. Rather than competing for scarce resources, the community began coordinating their efforts, sharing water rights, combining herbs for more efficient grazing, and pooling resources for emergency feed purchases from distant suppliers. Elizabeth's role in facilitating these agreements established her as an unofficial community mediator, someone who could navigate between different cultural groups and economic interests. The skills she had developed as a seamstress, attention to detail, patience with difficult clients, ability to envision how separate pieces might fit together, proved surprisingly applicable to community diplomacy. The drought also brought personal challenges that tested Elizabeth's resilience in unexpected ways. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose, was born during the worst of the dry spell, when stress and poor nutrition made pregnancy more difficult than it had been with Thomas. The birth was complicated, requiring Dr. Henderson's assistance, and leaving Elizabeth weakened for weeks afterward. "You need to take better care of yourself," Ruth Patterson scolded as she helped Elizabeth with household tasks during her recovery. "You can't solve everyone's problems while neglecting your own health." Elizabeth, holding baby Rose while supervising 3-year-old Thomas's attempts to help with chores, smiled wearily. "I'm learning that motherhood doesn't stop for droughts or community crises, but I also can't stop being who I am just because I have children." "Nobody's asking you to stop being yourself," Ruth replied, But being yourself includes being a mother now. That means sometimes putting your family's needs ahead of the community's. The advice was wise, but Elizabeth struggled to implement it. Her sense of responsibility for the community's welfare had grown out of her own transformation from helpless outsider to capable insider. She found it difficult to step back from leadership roles, even when her family responsibilities demanded more attention. The tension between personal and community obligations came to a head when the territorial governor visited their valley to assess drought relief needs. Elizabeth was asked to serve as the primary spokesperson for the ranching community, a role that would require several days of meetings and potentially travel to the territorial capital. "It's an honor," Daniel said, when they discussed the opportunity, recognition of everything you've accomplished here. But it's also a lot of responsibility, and Rose is still so young. Elizabeth felt torn between pride at the recognition and anxiety about leaving her infant daughter for extended periods. "Maybe I should decline. There are other people who could represent the community. Are there?" Daniel asked gently. "Who else has your combination of business experience, community connections, and ability to work with both Anglo and Hispanic families?" The question forced Elizabeth to acknowledge something she had been reluctant to admit. Her unique position in the community came with obligations she couldn't easily transfer to others. Her transformation from mail-order bride to community leader had been so gradual that she hadn't fully recognized the extent of her influence until others began depending on it. The meetings with the territorial governor proved to be both challenging and rewarding. Elizabeth found herself discussing complex issues of water rights, land use, and economic development with officials who initially seemed surprised to encounter a woman in such a role. Her ability to present detailed information and propose practical solutions gradually won their respect. "Mrs. Caldwell," the governor said during their final meeting, "you've provided the most comprehensive assessment of drought impact I've received from any region. Have you considered a position with the territorial government? We need people with your analytical abilities and community connections." The offer was flattering but held no appeal for Elizabeth. "Thank you, Governor, but my place is here in the valley. These people aren't just my neighbors, they're my family. I can't serve them effectively from a government office in Denver." The governor's proposal did prompt Elizabeth to think more seriously about her long-term goals and the legacy she wanted to build. As their community grew and changed, what kind of future did she want to help create for her children and their children? The answer came gradually through conversations with other women in the valley who were facing similar questions about balancing family responsibilities with community leadership. Maria Santos, a widow who ran a successful trading post, spoke about the importance of creating opportunities for the next generation. "My son, he wants to study law," Maria said during one of their informal gatherings at Elizabeth's ranch, "but there is no school here that can prepare him. He must go away, maybe never come back." The comment sparked a discussion about educational opportunities that revealed a significant gap in the community's development. While the valley had established basic schools for young children, there were no provisions for advanced education that might keep talented young people in the region. "We need to think about starting a proper academy," Elizabeth said, her mind already beginning to organize the logistics. "Something that could prepare students for college or professional training while keeping them connected to the community." The idea gained momentum as other parents expressed similar concerns. Elizabeth found herself leading another community initiative, this time focused on educational development rather than economic survival. The work required extensive correspondence with educational authorities, fundraising among local families, and negotiations with potential teachers willing to relocate to frontier conditions. Building the San Juan Valley Academy became Elizabeth's major project during 1882 and 1883. The effort drew on every skill she had developed: her seamstress precision for detailed planning, her business acumen for financial management, her community mediation abilities for resolving conflicts between different families' visions for the school. The academy that finally opened in the fall of 1883 represented more than just an educational institution. It symbolized the community's commitment to permanence, their belief that the valley could support not just survival, but genuine prosperity and cultural development. Elizabeth felt enormous pride when she watched the first class of 12 students begin their studies in subjects ranging from advanced mathematics to classical literature. "You've built something that will outlast all of us," Daniel observed as they attended the academy's dedication ceremony. "Those students will carry the education they receive here to communities across the territory." Elizabeth nodded, understanding that the academy represented the culmination of her transformation from someone seeking security to someone creating opportunities for others. "I think this is what I was meant to do all along, not just survive in this place, but help it become somewhere worth staying." The success of the academy attracted attention from other frontier communities facing similar challenges. Elizabeth began receiving visitors and correspondence from women in distant valleys who wanted to replicate her educational initiative. She found herself becoming an informal consultant on community development, sharing strategies and lessons learned through years of trial and error. One visitor who particularly impressed Elizabeth was Catherine Walsh, a young teacher from Kansas, who was considering establishing a school in the mining camps near Leadville. Catherine reminded Elizabeth of her younger self, intelligent, determined, but uncertain about her ability to succeed in challenging circumstances. "Mrs. Caldwell," Catherine said during her week-long visit to observe the academy's operations, "how did you know you could accomplish all this? When you started, did you have a plan for everything you've built?" Elizabeth laughed, remembering her own naive expectations when she first arrived in Colorado. "Miss Walsh, when I stepped off that train in Silverton, I couldn't even milk a cow properly. I never planned to become a community leader or start a school. I just kept doing whatever needed to be done next." "But how did you develop the confidence to take on such large projects?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "I think confidence comes from surviving things you didn't think you could survive. Each challenge you overcome proves to yourself that you're stronger than you knew. Eventually, you stop asking whether you can do something and start asking how you're going to do it." Catherine's visit reinforced Elizabeth's growing sense that her personal story was part of a larger movement of women who were redefining what was possible on the American frontier. They weren't just supporting their husbands' ambitions or enduring hardship with quiet resignation. They were actively shaping their communities and creating new models of female leadership. This awareness led Elizabeth to begin documenting her experiences and the lessons she had learned about frontier life. What started as personal letters to Catherine and other women evolved into a more systematic effort to record the practical knowledge and community strategies that had proven successful in the San Juan Valley. "You should consider publishing these observations," suggested Dr. Henderson when he read some of Elizabeth's writings during a social visit. "There are women all over the West who could benefit from your experiences, and back east, people have very little understanding of what frontier life actually requires." The idea of publication appealed to Elizabeth, but she wondered whether her story would seem credible to readers who hadn't experienced frontier conditions. The transformation from mail-order bride to community leader was so dramatic that it might sound like fiction rather than authentic experience. "Maybe that's exactly why it needs to be told," Daniel suggested when they discussed the possibility. People need to understand that the West isn't just about men with guns and cattle drives. Women are building the institutions and communities that will make this region permanently civilized. As 1884 approached, and Elizabeth reflected on the 5 years since her arrival in Colorado, she marveled at the distance she had traveled, not in miles, but in personal growth and community impact. The frightened young woman who had answered Thomas's advertisement had evolved into someone she could never have imagined becoming. The mountains rose around her home like protective walls, beautiful and stern, promising that they would continue to test and strengthen everyone who chose to make a life among them. Elizabeth faced that promise without fear, knowing she had already proven herself equal to whatever challenges lay ahead. She was no longer the woman who had answered a mail-order bride advertisement. She was Elizabeth Caldwell, frontier woman, mother, businesswoman, educator, and community builder, and she was exactly who she was meant to be. The transformation was complete, but Elizabeth understood that completion didn't mean ending. It meant readiness for whatever new chapters her life in the Colorado Territory might bring. Looking toward the future, she saw endless possibilities for growth, service, and adventure in the land she had chosen, and that had chosen her in return. The year 1885 brought an unexpected visitor that would challenge Elizabeth's understanding of her own journey in ways she could never have anticipated. A well-dressed woman in her 50s stepped off the morning train in Silverton, asking directions to the Caldwell Ranch with the precise diction and careful mannerisms of Boston society. "Mrs. Caldwell," the woman said when Elizabeth answered the door, "I am Margaret Whitmore, your former employer. I believe you remember me." Elizabeth's hands went instinctively to her apron, smoothing the practical wool dress she wore for daily ranch work. Mrs. Whitmore had indeed been her employer at the dress shop, a demanding woman who had criticized Elizabeth's rustic background and limited social connections. Seeing her standing on the front porch of the ranch felt surreal, like witnessing a collision between two completely different worlds. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elizabeth managed, recovering her composure. "This is certainly unexpected. Please come inside." As Mrs. Whitmore entered the main room of the cabin, Elizabeth saw her former employer's eyes take in the rustic furniture, the children's toys scattered across the floor, and the obvious signs of a working household rather than a parlor designed in for entertainment. The assessment was swift and, Elizabeth suspected, unfavorable. "I've come on behalf of your Aunt Prudence," Mrs. Whitmore announced without preamble. "She passed away last month and left you a considerable inheritance. However, claiming it requires your presence in Boston to settle legal matters." Elizabeth felt the room spin slightly. Aunt Prudence had been her mother's sister, a spinster, who had worked as a governess for wealthy families and had occasionally sent small gifts at Christmas. Elizabeth had always assumed her aunt disapproved of her decision to seek marriage through correspondence. "How considerate," Elizabeth asked, her practical nature asserting itself despite the shock. Mrs. Whitmore consulted a document from her traveling bag. "Approximately $8,000, plus ownership of a modest house in Cambridge. Your aunt was quite frugal and invested wisely over many years. The sum was staggering by frontier standards, enough to purchase several ranches or establish a substantial business." Elizabeth found herself calculating possibilities even as she tried to process the emotional implications of her aunt's unexpected generosity. "There is, however, a condition," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "Your aunt's will specifies that you must return to Massachusetts within 6 months to claim the inheritance and remain there for at least 2 years to demonstrate your commitment to civilized society." Elizabeth felt anger flare in her chest. Civilized society? What exactly does that mean? Mrs. Whitmore's expression suggested the answer should be obvious. It means abandoning this wilderness existence and returning to proper social circles. where your education and background can be put to appropriate use. Your aunt was concerned that you had been diminished by frontier life. Diminished. Elizabeth's voice carried a dangerous edge that would have been unthinkable in her Boston days. Mrs. Whitmore, I've built businesses, helped establish schools, mediated community disputes, and raised children in circumstances that would terrify most Boston ladies. How exactly is that diminished? Mrs. Whitmore's carefully controlled expression suggested she found Elizabeth's response both shocking and predictable. My dear, you're living in a log cabin, doing manual labor, and associating with people of questionable background. Surely you can see that this is no life for a woman of your intelligence and breeding. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Mrs. Whitmore painting increasingly elaborate pictures of the comfortable life Elizabeth could enjoy in Boston with her inheritance. A house in a respectable neighborhood, social connections through her aunt's former employers, opportunities to establish a proper dressmaking business serving elite clientele. You could have servants again, Mrs. Whitmore emphasized. Real servants, not the arrangements you've made here. You could attend concerts, lectures, and social events. Your children could receive proper education at established schools rather than this frontier academy you've created. Elizabeth listened to the litany of urban advantages with growing amazement at how completely unappealing they sounded. The life Mrs. Whitmore described, comfortable, predictable, socially acceptable, was exactly what she had been fleeing when she answered Thomas's advertisement 5 years earlier. After Mrs. Whitmore departed for her hotel in Silverton, Elizabeth sat alone in her kitchen, trying to understand why the offer felt more like a trap than an opportunity. $8,000 represented security beyond anything she had ever imagined, yet the thought of claiming it filled her with dread rather than excitement. Daniel found her there when he returned from working with the horses, staring into her coffee cup with an expression he had learned to recognize as serious contemplation. "Bad news?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. Elizabeth explained Mrs. Whitmore's visit and her aunt's request, watching Daniel's face carefully for his reaction. She saw surprise, calculation, and something that might have been worried cross his features as he absorbed the implications. $8,000, he said finally. That's more money than most people see in a lifetime out here. Yes, Elizabeth agreed. But claiming it means leaving everything we've built, everything we are. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the magnitude of the decision they faced. Elizabeth, I can't ask you to give up that kind of inheritance for me or for this place. That money could give you and the children opportunities I'll never be able to provide. Elizabeth reached across the table and took his hands in hers. Daniel Caldwell, you listen to me carefully. You and this place have already given me something more valuable than money, the chance to become who I was meant to be. I wouldn't trade that for all the comfortable parlors in Boston. But what about Thomas and Rose? Don't they deserve every advantage we can give them? Elizabeth considered this seriously, understanding that her decision would affect not just her own future, but her children's possibilities. They deserve to grow up with parents who are fulfilled and purposeful, in a community that values strength and character over social position. That's not what they'd find in Boston. Over the following days, Elizabeth and Daniel discussed every aspect of the inheritance offer. They considered compromises. Perhaps Elizabeth could travel to Boston briefly to claim the money and return immediately. Or they could use the inheritance to expand their Colorado operations rather than relocating permanently. But investigation revealed that Aunt Prudence's will was carefully crafted to prevent such arrangements. The 2-year residency requirement was absolute, and the funds would be held in trust by Boston lawyers who had clear instructions to verify Elizabeth's compliance with all conditions. Your aunt really wanted to rescue you from frontier life, Daniel observed wryly after reading the legal documents Mrs. Whitmore had left for their review. She thought $8,000 would be enough to overcome any attachment you'd develop to this place. Elizabeth felt a mixture of sadness and amusement at her aunt's misunderstanding. Prudence had undoubtedly meant well, but she had fundamentally misread both Elizabeth's character and her circumstances. The inheritance was offered as salvation from a life Prudence viewed as degrading, but Elizabeth had already saved herself through her own efforts. The decision became clear during a community meeting about winter preparations. Elizabeth watched. Her neighbors, ranchers, merchants, teachers, miners, working together to ensure everyone would survive the harsh months ahead. She saw Sarah Martinez organizing food distribution for families in need, Ben Patterson coordinating woodcutting for elderly residents, and Dr. Henderson training several women in basic medical care. These people had become more than neighbors. They were family in the truest sense. They had shared dangers, celebrated successes, and supported each other through every crisis the frontier could produce. The thought of abandoning them for the social proprieties of Boston society felt like betrayal. "I've made my decision," Elizabeth announced to Daniel that evening as they prepared for bed. "I'm declining the inheritance." Daniel studied her face in the lamplight, clearly searching for any sign of regret or uncertainty. "Are you sure? That's a lot of money to walk away from." "It's not walking away from money," Elizabeth replied. "It's choosing one kind of wealth over another. We have something here that can't be purchased with $8,000 or $80,000. We have a life we've built with our own hands, a community that depends on us, and work that matters." The letter Elizabeth wrote to the Boston lawyers was brief and definitive. She formally declined her aunt's request, understanding that the money would likely go to distant relatives who would appreciate it more than she ever could. She felt no regret about the decision, only relief at having resolved the question permanently. Mrs. Whitmore's reaction to the news was predictably dramatic. She appeared at the ranch the next morning, her usual composure shattered by what she clearly viewed as Elizabeth's incomprehensible folly. "You're making the greatest mistake of your life," Mrs. Whitmore declared. "This wilderness has clearly affected your judgment. No rational woman would choose poverty over comfort, isolation over society." Elizabeth smiled calmly as she continued kneading bread dough, her hands steady and sure in their familiar work. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not choosing poverty. I'm choosing richness of a different kind, and I'm certainly not choosing isolation. I'm part of a community here in ways I never was in Boston." "Community?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried obvious disdain. "You mean these rough frontier people? What kind of society can they possibly provide?" Elizabeth paused in her kneading and looked directly at her former employer. "The kind where people are judged by their character and capabilities rather than their parentage and possessions. The kind where women can build businesses, lead institutions, and shape their communities' futures. The kind where I matter." Mrs. Whitmore departed that afternoon, clearly convinced that frontier life had damaged Elizabeth's mental faculties beyond repair. Elizabeth felt sorry for the older woman's inability to understand that different people might find fulfillment in different circumstances. The incident with the inheritance clarified something important for Elizabeth about the trajectory of her life. She had not simply adapted to frontier circumstances or made the best of a difficult situation. She had actively chosen this life, repeatedly and consciously, even when alternatives were available. This realization led Elizabeth to undertake a project she had been contemplating for months, writing a comprehensive account of her experiences for publication, not just advice for other frontier women, but a complete narrative that might help readers understand how profoundly the American West was changing people and communities. "I want to tell the truth about what it means to build a life out here," Elizabeth explained to Daniel as she organized her notes and correspondence. Not the romanticized versions in dime novels or the horror stories in Eastern newspapers, but the real experience of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The writing project consumed Elizabeth's evenings through the winter of 1885-1886. She found herself reliving every stage of her transformation, from the frightened woman on the train to the confident community leader she had become. The process was both emotionally challenging and deeply satisfying, forcing her to articulate changes she had lived through but never fully analyzed. Daniel proved to be an invaluable editor, asking questions that helped Elizabeth clarify her thoughts and suggesting details that might interest readers unfamiliar with frontier life. Their children, now old enough to understand that their mother was creating something important, often played quietly nearby, while Elizabeth wrote by lamplight. "Will people really want to read about our life?" Daniel asked one evening, as Elizabeth shared a particularly detailed chapter about establishing the Valley Academy. "I think people are hungry for authentic stories about the West," Elizabeth replied, "especially stories that show how families and communities are built, not just how gunfighters and cattle rustlers operate." The manuscript that emerged from Elizabeth's winter writing was over 300 pages long, covering everything from her initial decision to answer Thomas's advertisement through the establishment of the Academy and her recent decision to decline her aunt's inheritance. She titled it Letters from the San Juan, a woman's journey from mail-order bride to frontier leader. Finding a publisher proved more challenging than writing the book. Eastern publishers were skeptical that readers would be interested in a woman's perspective on frontier life, while Western publishers doubted that a story without significant violence or adventure would appeal to their audience. The breakthrough came through an unexpected connection. Catherine Walsh, the teacher Elizabeth had mentored, had successfully established her school in Leadville and had contacts with educational publications. She introduced Elizabeth's manuscript to the editor of a magazine called The Western Woman's Journal, which had recently begun publication in Denver. "This is exactly what our readers need to see," the editor, Mrs. Helen Morrison, wrote to Elizabeth. "Too many accounts of Western life focus on exceptional events, Indian wars, mining strikes, criminal activity. Your story shows how ordinary women are building the foundations of civilized society throughout the territory." The magazine published Elizabeth's account as a 6-part serial beginning in the spring of 1886. The response was overwhelming, with letters arriving from women across the West who shared similar experiences and thanked Elizabeth for giving voice to their struggles and achievements. More importantly, the publication led to invitations for Elizabeth to speak at women's clubs and educational conferences throughout the territory. She found herself traveling to Denver, Colorado Springs, and even Salt Lake City to share her insights about community development and women's roles in frontier society. These speaking engagements revealed to Elizabeth that her personal story was part of a much larger transformation occurring throughout the American West. Women everywhere were taking on leadership roles, building institutions, and reshaping their communities in ways that challenged traditional expectations about gender and capability. "You've become something of a celebrity," Daniel observed with obvious pride as Elizabeth prepared for another speaking trip. "There are women who travel hundreds of miles just to hear you talk about our life here." Elizabeth laughed at the idea of celebrity, but she understood that her story had resonated with people because it demonstrated possibilities they hadn't known existed. "I think what they're really interested in is proof that ordinary people can build extraordinary lives if they're willing to work for them." As 1887 dawned, and Elizabeth reflected on the 8 years since her arrival in Colorado Territory, she marveled at the scope of changes she had witnessed and helped create. The isolated valley where she had first learned to milk cows now supported a thriving community of over 200 families. The academy she had helped establish was graduating students who went on to colleges and professional schools throughout the region. Most remarkably, the frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off the train in Silverton had evolved into a recognized authority on community development and women's leadership. Elizabeth's transformation had become a model for other women, seeking to create meaningful lives in challenging circumstances. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of her evolution was how completely natural it felt. Elizabeth had not forced herself to become someone alien to her nature. She had simply discovered capabilities that had always existed, but had never been tested. The frontier had not changed her as much as it had revealed who she had always been capable of becoming. Standing on her porch one morning, watching the sun rise over the San Juan peaks while her children played in the yard and Daniel worked with his horses, Elizabeth felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had found exactly where they belonged. The mountains that had once seemed intimidating now felt like home, and the community she had helped build felt like family. The mail order. Bride adventure had ended years ago, but the real adventure, building a life worth living in a place worth defending, continued with each new day. Elizabeth Caldwell faced that ongoing adventure with confidence, purpose, and joy, knowing that she had already proven herself capable of meeting whatever challenges or opportunities the future might bring. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.